Throughout history, certain people have simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind mysteries that have puzzled investigators for generations. These disappearances, from remote mountains to busy cities, from experienced explorers to ordinary families, share disturbing patterns that continue to baffle experts today. This is not a collection of ghost stories or supernatural tales. This is a serious examination of real cases, real people, and real investigations that have consumed countless hours of police work, search efforts, and scientific analysis. From the frozen wilderness of Russia to the jungles of Panama, from airplane cockpits to underground caves, these stories will take you into the world of missing persons investigations. Roanoke Colony Disappearance, 1587. The morning of August 18th, 1590 started like any other day for the crew of the Hopewell. But as they approached the shores of Roanoke Island, something felt wrong. The silence was too complete. John White, the colony's governor, stared at the coastline he had last seen 3 years earlier, where 117 English colonists should have been living, working, and building England's first permanent settlement in the New World. There was nothing but empty beach and overgrown wilderness. White's hands shook as he climbed into the smaller boat that would take him to shore. Among those missing colonists was his own daughter Eleanor and his granddaughter Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America. He had no idea that he was about to discover what would become one of history's most enduring mysteries. The investigation into the lost colony of Roanoke began the moment White's boots touched the sand. What he found defied explanation. The settlement that had once housed over 100 people was gone. Not destroyed by fire or storm, but methodically dismantled. The houses had been taken down carefully, the timber nowhere to be found. Personal belongings were missing, but there were no signs of struggle or violence. White and his men searched every inch of the former settlement. They found the defensive palisade still standing, but inside it only empty ground where homes had once stood. The colonists had clearly left, but how and why remained a mystery. Then, carved into one of the wooden posts of the palisade, White discovered something that would haunt investigators for centuries: the word Croatoan. The carving was deep and deliberate, not scratched hastily in panic. Near the settlement's entrance, they found additional letters carved into a tree. CRO. White knew immediately what these markings meant. Before he had left for England in 1587, he had made an agreement with the colonists. If they were forced to leave Roanoke Island, they would carve their destination into a tree or post. If they left under duress or attack, they would include a cross above the carving. There was no cross. Modern investigators have spent decades analysing these carvings. Forensic linguists have studied the lettering style and depth of the cuts. The word Croatoan referred to a nearby island now known as Hatteras Island, home to the Croatoan people who had been friendly to the English. The partial word CRO suggested the colonists may have been interrupted while carving, or that it was simply an abbreviated version of the same message. But White never made it to Croatoan Island to verify where his people had gone. A violent storm arose as his ships prepared to investigate, and his anchor cables snapped. The crew, eager to return to England and fearful of the approaching hurricane season, refused to search further. White was forced to abandon his investigation, leaving behind not only the mystery of the lost colonists, but also any hope of reuniting with his family. The formal investigation into the Roanoke colony's disappearance began years later when the English established their next permanent settlement at Jamestown in 1607. Captain John Smith, the colony's leader, made finding the lost colonists a priority. Smith sent search parties and questioned local Native American tribes about the fate of the Roanoke settlers. The reports Smith gathered were contradictory and troubling. Some Native Americans claimed the colonists had been killed by a hostile tribe. Others insisted they had seen European settlers living among various tribes throughout the region. A chief named Powhatan told Smith that he had ordered the massacre of the colonists, but his account contained details that didn't match the physical evidence from Roanoke Island. Archaeological investigations began in earnest in the 20th century. Teams of researchers have excavated the original settlement site on Roanoke Island, searching for clues about what happened to the colonists. They found evidence of the palisade White described, along with artifacts that confirm the location of the settlement. But they've discovered no human remains, no signs of violence, and no clear evidence of what caused the colonists to leave. One of the most significant modern investigations was led by archaeologist Nick Lucchetti, who has spent decades studying the Roanoke site. His team has uncovered pottery shards, metal fragments, and other artifacts that paint a picture of daily life in the colony. But these findings only deepen the mystery. The artifacts suggest the colonists lived normally right up until their disappearance, with no signs of preparation for a sudden departure. In recent years, investigators have expanded their search beyond Roanoke Island. The first colony foundation, established specifically to solve the mystery, has conducted extensive archaeological surveys throughout the region. Their work has focused on two main locations: Hatteras Island, where the Croatoan people lived, and an area about 50 miles inland known as Site X, identified through analysis of John White's maps. The Hatteras Island investigations have yielded intriguing results. Archaeologists have found European artifacts dating to the late 16th century, including a rapier hilt, copper fittings, and iron tools that could have belonged to the lost colonists. These discoveries support the theory that at least some of the colonists travelled to Croatoan Island as their carved message indicated. But the most significant recent discovery came from the 2023 and 2024 excavations at the Elizabethan Gardens on Roanoke Island. Archaeologists uncovered what they believe to be the site of the original Algonquian village of Roanoke, where the colonists first made contact with local Native Americans. The discovery of 16th century Algonquian pottery, alongside a copper ring of European origin, suggests ongoing contact between the colonists and local tribes. Dr. Eric Klingelhofer, who has led many of these excavations, believes this evidence points to a more complex story than simple disappearance. The colonists may have integrated with local communities, splitting into smaller groups for better survival chances. This theory is supported by historical accounts from later English settlements that described encounters with Native Americans who possessed European features and spoke English words. The investigation has also embraced modern technology. DNA analysis has become a crucial tool in trying to trace the colonists' fate. The Lost Colony DNA Project has collected genetic samples from families throughout the region, looking for European markers that might indicate descent from the lost colonists. While the results have been inconclusive, they've identified several family lines that show unusual genetic patterns consistent with European ancestry in the late 16th century. Ground-penetrating radar has been used to search for hidden structures or burial sites that might have been missed by traditional excavation. Satellite imagery has helped identify potential settlement locations throughout the region. Computer modelling has been employed to analyse the most likely routes the colonists might have taken and the most probable locations for secondary settlements. Forensic anthropologists have also joined the investigation, analysing the few human remains found in the region from the relevant time period. While no remains have been definitively linked to the lost colonists, the analysis has provided insights into the health and living conditions of 16th century settlers in the area. The investigation has revealed that the colonists faced significant challenges even before their disappearance. Archaeological evidence shows they struggled with food shortages, had difficulty adapting to local agricultural methods, and faced increasing tensions with some Native American groups. The colony's isolation from England, combined with these survival challenges, may have motivated their decision to leave Roanoke Island. Modern investigators have also examined the political and military context of the colony's disappearance. The ongoing war between England and Spain meant that any Spanish forces discovering the English settlement would have likely destroyed it. Some historians argue that the colonists may have been attacked by Spanish troops, though no physical evidence supports this theory. The psychological profile of the colonists has become another area of investigation. These were not inexperienced adventurers, but skilled craftspeople, farmers, and families who had committed to building a permanent settlement. Their organised departure from Roanoke Island suggests careful planning rather than panicked flight. This behavioural analysis has influenced how investigators approach the mystery, focusing on rational decision-making rather than catastrophic events. Environmental factors have also been studied extensively. Tree ring analysis has revealed that the colonists disappeared during one of the worst droughts in the region's history. This environmental stress may have forced them to abandon their settlement in search of better resources, possibly explaining why they left no clear trail for rescuers to follow. The investigation continues today, with new technologies and approaches constantly being applied to the centuries-old mystery. Recent developments in forensic archaeology, including improved techniques for analysing trace evidence and better methods for dating artefacts, have renewed hope that the fate of the lost colonists may finally be determined. What makes the Roanoke investigation unique is its longevity and the sheer number of researchers who have contributed to it over the centuries. From John White's initial search in 1590 to the high-tech archaeological surveys of today, the investigation has evolved with each generation of researchers bringing new tools and perspectives to the mystery. The evidence collected over more than 4 centuries of investigation suggests that the colonists' disappearance was not a single catastrophic event, but a gradual process of adaptation and integration with local communities. The carved message of Croatoan was likely just the beginning of a longer journey that took the colonists far from their original settlement and into a world where English and Native American cultures merged in ways that left few traces for modern investigators to follow. Flannan Isles Mystery, 1900. 21 miles off the coast of Scotland, surrounded by the violent waters of the North Atlantic, stands a lighthouse that has become synonymous with one of maritime history's most puzzling mysteries. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse on Elian Moor was built to guide ships safely through these treacherous waters, but on December 26, 1900, it became the centre of a mystery that would baffle investigators for over a century. 3 experienced lighthouse keepers had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a perfectly maintained lighthouse, a stopped clock, and questions that remain unanswered to this day. The mystery begins with the simple fact that, on December 15, 1900, at 9 a.m, the lighthouse logbook recorded its final entry. James Duckett, the principal keeper, Thomas Marshall, the first assistant, and Donald MacArthur, the second assistant, were all accounted for and performing their duties normally. By December 26th, when the relief vessel Hesperus arrived with supplies and replacement keeper Joseph Moore, all 3 men had disappeared completely. Moore climbed the rocky steps to the lighthouse that morning, expecting to find his colleagues waiting for him as usual. Instead, he discovered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The entrance gate was closed but not locked. The main door was shut tight. When he called out, no one answered. Inside the lighthouse, Moore found beds unmade, a clock stopped at 8:25, and a meal half-eaten on the table. The lighthouse lens was clean and operational, the oil reservoirs were full, and the light had been working properly until the men vanished. The most unsettling discovery was what Moore found in the cloakroom. 2 sets of oilskins were hanging on their hooks, but the 3rd set was missing. This detail would become crucial to every theory that followed. Why had one man taken his weather gear, while the other 2 had not? What emergency could have called all 3 men outside, but given only one of them time to dress for the weather? The official investigation began immediately. Robert Muirhead, the superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board, arrived to conduct a thorough examination of the scene. His report, filed on December 29, 1900, documented everything in meticulous detail. The lighthouse was in perfect working order. The lamp had been cleaned and refilled. The mechanism that rotated the lens was properly wound. There were no signs of struggle inside the building. The men had simply vanished. Muirhead's investigation revealed something even more puzzling. The lighthouse logbook, which keepers were required to update every few hours, showed normal entries up until 9 a.m. on December 15th. But there were no entries for the next 10 days. Either the men had abandoned their most basic duty or something had prevented them from making any records. Neither explanation made sense for 3 experienced keepers who had worked together for months without incident. The first theory investigators considered was suicide. Could one of the keepers have killed the others before taking his own life? This theory was quickly dismissed. There were no signs of violence in the lighthouse. No weapons were missing. The men's personal belongings were undisturbed. Most importantly, no bodies were found on the island despite extensive searches of every cave, cliff and crevice. Weather records from the time became a crucial piece of evidence. The investigation revealed that severe storms had battered the area around December 15th, with winds reaching hurricane force. This led to the most widely accepted theory, that the men had been swept away by a massive wave while trying to secure equipment outside the lighthouse. The missing oilskins suggested that one keeper had dressed for the weather, possibly to check on something damaged by the storm. But this theory had serious flaws. The lighthouse was built 150 feet above sea level, specifically to protect it from even the most violent storms. The platform where the keepers would have worked was 70 feet above the highest recorded wave in the area. For a wave to reach that height would require conditions far beyond anything recorded in the region's weather history. Additionally, if the men had been swept away by a wave, why were there no signs of water damage inside the lighthouse? The investigation team examined every inch of the island's rocky coastline, looking for evidence that the men had been working outside during the storm. They found some damage to equipment stored in a concrete box about 100 feet above sea level, but this only deepened the mystery. The box had been damaged by the storm, but it was still far below the level of the lighthouse platform. If the men had gone down to check on this equipment, why hadn't they returned when the storm intensified? Captain Harvey of the Hesperus, who had transported more to the island, provided another crucial piece of evidence. He reported that the lighthouse had been dark for several nights before December 26th. Ships passing through the area had noted the absence of the light beam. This meant the men had disappeared sometime between December 15th and December 20th, during the worst of the storm. The supernatural theory emerged almost immediately and refused to die. Local legends spoke of the Flannan Isles as a place where spirits dwelled. The islands were considered sacred by ancient Celtic peoples, and some claimed they were cursed. Sailors reported seeing phantom lights and hearing strange sounds from the islands. When news of the disappearance spread, these old stories gained new life. Had the keepers encountered something supernatural on that storm-lashed night? Investigators dismissed the supernatural explanations, but they couldn't explain away all the strange details. Why had the clock stopped at exactly 8:25? Why was the kitchen table set for a meal that was never finished? Why had the men's personal belongings been left behind, including money and valuables they would have taken if they had planned to leave? The mental breakdown theory gained traction when investigators learned more about the psychological pressures of lighthouse keeping. The isolation, the constant sound of wind and waves, the repetitive nature of the work and the long winter nights could drive men to madness. Perhaps one keeper had suffered a breakdown and somehow caused the others to disappear. But this theory also had problems. All three men were experienced lighthouse keepers who had worked in isolated conditions for years. They had shown no signs of mental distress in their recent letters home. The murder theory was thoroughly investigated. Could someone have reached the island and killed the keepers? The logistics made this almost impossible. The Flannan Isles were 21 miles from the nearest populated area, surrounded by dangerous waters that few boats could navigate safely. Any vessel approaching the island would have been spotted by the keepers, who were trained to watch for ships in distress. There were no reports of boats in the area during the relevant time period. One of the most intriguing aspects of the investigation was the discovery of damage to the island's concrete structures. The storm had been powerful enough to damage a concrete box that was 100 feet above sea level and positioned in a sheltered crevice. This gave credence to the theory that the men had been swept away by an extraordinary wave, but it also raised new questions. If waves could reach that height, why was there no water damage inside the lighthouse itself? The investigative team consulted with marine engineers about the possibility of rogue waves. These are extremely rare oceanic phenomena where multiple wave systems combine to create waves far larger than normal conditions would suggest. A rogue wave could theoretically reach heights that would threaten even the lighthouse platform, but for such a wave to occur during the exact period when the men disappeared seemed like an impossible coincidence. The clothing evidence became a key focus of the investigation. The missing oilskins suggested that one keeper had prepared for harsh weather, but the other two had not. This led to a new theory. Perhaps one man had gone outside to check on something, encountered trouble and called for help. The other two had rushed out without proper clothing to assist him, and all three had been swept away. This scenario explained the missing oilskins and the abandoned meal, but even this theory had weaknesses. Lighthouse keepers were trained never to leave their post unmanned, especially during storms. The regulations were clear. At least one keeper must remain inside at all times to tend the light. For all three men to abandon their posts simultaneously would have required an extraordinary emergency. The investigation expanded to examine the men's personal lives. James Ducat was a veteran lighthouse keeper with over 20 years of experience. He had a wife and children who described him as reliable and mentally stable. Thomas Marshall was known for his calm demeanour and professional competence. Donald MacArthur, the youngest of the three, was described as physically strong and capable. None of them had debts, enemies, or personal problems that might explain their disappearance. The timeline of events became crucial to understanding what had happened. The lighthouse was last seen operating normally on December 15th. Ships reported the light was out by December 20th. The relief boat arrived on December 26th. This gave investigators a narrow window of time to focus on, but it also meant that any evidence of what had happened had been exposed to 6 days of winter storms. Modern investigations have used advanced technology to re-examine the mystery. Computer modelling of wave patterns around the Flannan Isles has confirmed that rogue waves are possible in the area, though extremely rare. Psychological studies have provided new insights into the mental pressures faced by lighthouse keepers, but none of these modern approaches have definitively solved the mystery. The most persistent theory remains that the men were swept away by a massive wave while trying to secure equipment damaged by the storm. This theory accounts for most of the evidence: the missing oilskins, the abandoned meal, the damaged equipment, and the absence of the men's bodies. It also explains why the lighthouse remained operational until the men disappeared. They had maintained their duties until the very end. However, this theory still cannot explain all the details. Why did the clock stop at 8:25? Why were there no distress signals or emergency protocols activated? Why did experienced keepers violate their training by leaving the lighthouse unmanned? These questions have kept the mystery alive for over a century. The Flannan Isles disappearance has become a template for maritime mysteries. It demonstrates how quickly experienced professionals can vanish without trace, how environmental factors can destroy evidence, and how the isolation of lighthouse work could lead to situations where help was impossible. The case has influenced maritime safety regulations, lighthouse automation programs, and emergency communication systems. What makes this mystery particularly enduring is the combination of logical explanations that don't quite fit and supernatural elements that can't be entirely dismissed. The remote location, the extreme weather conditions, and the complete absence of witnesses created perfect conditions for a mystery that defies easy solutions. Each new theory that emerges seems to explain some details while raising new questions about others. The investigation continues to this day, with maritime historians, meteorologists, and mystery enthusiasts regularly proposing new theories. The Flannan Isles lighthouse still operates, now automated and requiring no human keepers. But the questions about what happened on that December night in 1900 remain as puzzling as ever, ensuring that the 3 lighthouse keepers who vanished into the storm will never be forgotten. Bermuda Triangle disappearance, 1945. The briefing room at Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale was filled with the usual sounds of military preparation on the afternoon of December 5, 1945. World War II had ended just 3 months earlier, but the Navy's training operations continued with peacetime precision. What none of the men gathering for navigation problem number 1 could have imagined was that they were about to become part of one of aviation's most enduring mysteries, their disappearance helping to create the legend of the Bermuda Triangle. At 1:45 p.m, Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor finished his final briefing for the 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers that would make up Flight 19. The mission was routine, a triangular navigation exercise that would take them east over the Bahamas, then north, then back southwest to Fort Lauderdale. Total flight time was estimated at 2 hours. The weather forecast called for scattered showers with a ceiling of 2,500 feet and moderate visibility. Nothing that would concern experienced Navy pilots. Taylor was the flight instructor, a veteran with over 2,500 flight hours who had served in the Pacific Theater during the war. His students were capable Navy airmen, but most were relatively new to the TBM Avenger. The aircraft assigned to the flight were all in good mechanical condition, each carrying enough fuel for a 6-hour flight. At 2:10 p.m, all 5 aircraft taxied to the runway and took off in perfect formation. The first hour of the flight proceeded exactly as planned. The 5 Avengers flew east-northeast on a heading of 091 degrees, travelling 56 nautical miles to their first checkpoint over the Bahamas. At 3:40 p.m, they should have reached their bombing target at Hens and Chicken Shoals, dropped their practice bombs, and turned north for the second leg of their triangular route. Instead, something went wrong. At 3:45 p.m, the control tower at Fort Lauderdale received the first indication of trouble. Taylor's voice crackled over the radio. Calling tower, this is an emergency. We seem to be off course. We cannot see land. Repeat, we cannot see land. The tower operator, familiar with routine training flights, asked for Taylor's position. The response was troubling. We are not sure of our position. We cannot be sure just where we are. We seem to be lost. The radio transmissions from Flight 19 over the next 2 hours would become some of the most analysed communications in aviation history. At 4 p.m, Taylor contacted another instructor pilot, Lieutenant Robert Cox, who was flying in the area. "What is your trouble?" Cox asked. Taylor's response revealed the depth of his confusion. "Both my compasses are out and I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale. I'm over land, but it's broken. I'm sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down and I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale." Cox tried to help Taylor navigate, but the conversation only highlighted how lost Flight 19 had become. Taylor believed he was flying over the Florida Keys south of his intended position. If this were true, flying north would bring him back to Fort Lauderdale, but radio direction finding equipment at several Navy installations was picking up Flight 19's transmissions from the northeast, suggesting they were actually over the Bahamas east of Florida. At 4:16 p.m, Taylor made a crucial decision that would seal Flight 19's fate. He ordered his flight to turn east, believing this would take them back to Florida. If he was actually over the Florida Keys, as he believed, this course would indeed bring them home. But if they were over the Bahamas, as the radio bearings suggested, turning east would take them further out over the Atlantic Ocean, away from land and safety. The radio transmissions continued, each one more desperate than the last. At 4:25 p.m, Taylor was heard saying, "We are heading 030 degrees for 45 minutes, then we will fly north to make sure we are not over the Gulf of Mexico." This transmission revealed Taylor's continued confusion about his location. He now seemed to believe he might be over the Gulf of Mexico, on Florida's west coast, when all evidence suggested he was east of the state. By 5 p.m, Flight 19 had been in the air for nearly 3 hours. The aircraft had enough fuel for 6 hours of flight, but Taylor's voice over the radio was becoming increasingly strained. "We are now heading west-southwest," he reported. The sun was setting, and navigation would become even more difficult in the approaching darkness. At 5:15 p.m, Taylor made another fateful decision. He turned control of the flight over to Marine Captain Edward Powers, the pilot of one of the other aircraft. Powers had been flying for several years and was familiar with the area, but by this time the situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. The flight was running low on fuel, darkness was falling, and their exact position remained unknown. The last coherent transmission from Flight 19 came at 6:04 p.m. Powers was heard saying, "We are all right now. We're having a fuel problem. If we just fly west, we will find land." But west was a relative term when their position was unknown. The radio signals were becoming weaker, suggesting the aircraft were moving further from the Florida coast. At 6:20 p.m, a faint transmission was picked up. "All planes close up tight. We will have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." This was the last communication ever received from Flight 19. 14 men in 5 aircraft had vanished into the darkness over the Atlantic. The search for Flight 19 began immediately. At 7:27 p.m, 2 PBM-5 Martin Mariner flying boats took off from Naval Air Station Banana River to search for the missing aircraft. The Mariners were large seaplanes, well equipped for search and rescue operations. One of them, designated Training 49, was piloted by Lieutenant Walter Jeffrey with a crew of 13 men. At 7:50 p.m, Training 49 reported its position as 23 degrees 30 minutes north, 79 degrees 34 minutes west, roughly 50 miles northeast of Nassau in the Bahamas. This was the last communication from the Mariner. At 9:12 p.m, the merchant ship Gaines Mills reported seeing an aircraft explode in flight and crash into the sea. The explosion was also observed by personnel at several other ships in the area. The search operation that followed was massive. Over the next 5 days, Navy and Coast Guard vessels scoured more than 250,000 square miles of ocean. Aircraft flew search patterns covering an additional 300,000 square miles. The operation involved 267 aircraft and 18 ships, making it one of the largest search efforts in naval history at that time. Despite the extensive search, no trace of Flight 19 or the missing Mariner was found. the ocean had swallowed 6 aircraft and 27 men without leaving a single piece of wreckage. The only confirmed loss was the PBM Mariner, which had exploded and crashed while searching for the missing training flight. The official Navy investigation concluded that Flight 19 had become lost due to Taylor's confusion about his position and had crashed into the ocean when the aircraft ran out of fuel. The report noted that Taylor had a history of getting lost during flights and had crashed 2 aircraft earlier in his career due to navigation errors. The weather conditions, while not ideal, were not severe enough to cause the disappearance. However, the investigation left many questions unanswered. How had an experienced pilot with over 2,500 flight hours become so thoroughly lost on a routine training flight? Why had both of Taylor's compasses failed simultaneously? Why had the radio direction finding equipment at multiple bases tracked the flight's signals from the northeast if Taylor was actually over the Florida Keys as he believed? The mystery deepened when investigators examined the radio transcripts more carefully. Some of the transmissions suggested that other members of Flight 19 disagreed with Taylor's navigation decisions. At one point, another pilot was heard saying if we would just fly west, we would get home. But Taylor, as the flight instructor, maintained command and continued flying east, away from land. The weather conditions on December 5, 1945, may have played a larger role than initially believed. While not severe, there were scattered thunderstorms in the area, and visibility was limited. The sun was obscured by clouds for much of the flight, making celestial navigation difficult. The magnetic compass readings in the area were also affected by local magnetic anomalies, which could have contributed to the navigation errors. The loss of Flight 19 occurred just as the concept of the Bermuda Triangle was beginning to take shape in popular culture. The disappearance of 5 military aircraft with no trace of wreckage seemed to fit perfectly with stories of mysterious vanishings in the area. Over the decades, the case has been cited as evidence of supernatural phenomena, alien abduction, and other unexplained forces. But meteorologists and aviation experts have offered more mundane explanations. The weather conditions over the Bahamas on December 5th included not only scattered thunderstorms, but also unusual wind patterns that could have affected the aircraft's navigation. The area is known for sudden weather changes that can disorient even experienced pilots. The human factor cannot be ignored. Taylor's confusion about his position appears to have been the primary cause of the disaster. His decision to fly east when he should have flown west took Flight 19 further from land and safety. The other pilots in the formation, though they may have questioned Taylor's decisions, were bound by military protocol to follow their instructors' commands. The fuel situation became critical around 8 p.m., 4 hours after the flight had begun. The TBM Avenger aircraft carried enough fuel for 6 hours of flight under normal conditions, but the extended flight time and possible headwinds would have reduced their range. When the aircraft finally ran out of fuel, they would have had to ditch in the ocean during darkness, making survival highly unlikely. The Atlantic Ocean in the area where Flight 19 disappeared is over 12,000 feet deep in some places. Aircraft that crash into such deep water are rarely recovered, especially with the search technology available in 1945. The lack of wreckage does not necessarily indicate anything mysterious. It simply reflects the ocean's ability to swallow aircraft without a trace. Jamison Family Deaths, 2009. In the quiet town of Eufaula, Oklahoma, nestled along the shores of a lake bearing the same name, the Jamison family lived a life that seemed ordinary from the outside, but was filled with complexities that few truly understood. Bobby Dale Jamison, 44, was a man carrying the weight of physical pain and family conflicts that had shaped his adult life. His wife, Sherilyn Leanne Jamison, 40, battled invisible demons that manifested in ways that often left those around her concerned and confused. Their daughter, 6-year-old Madison Stormy Star Jamison, was the bright spot in their troubled world, a child whose laughter could momentarily lift the heavy atmosphere that seemed to follow her parents wherever they went. The Jamison family's story began in 2002 when Bobby and Sherilyn first met. Their relationship moved quickly, with Madison being born the following year in August 2003. They married in 2004, creating what appeared to be a traditional family unit, but beneath the surface both Bobby and Sherilyn carried burdens that would eventually contribute to their tragic fate. Bobby's struggles began with chronic pain from a car accident that had left him disabled and unable to work. The constant discomfort affected not only his physical well-being, but also his mental state. He received disability benefits, which provided some financial stability, but the loss of his ability to work traditionally had taken a toll on his sense of purpose and self-worth. Those who knew Bobby described him as a man who had once been capable and hard-working, but who had become increasingly isolated and paranoid as his pain persisted. Sherilyn's challenges were different but equally devastating. She had been diagnosed with severe bipolar disorder, a condition that had worsened significantly after a previous divorce. The mental illness affected her ability to maintain employment, and like Bobby, she relied on disability benefits for income. Her condition manifested in extreme mood swings that could be frightening to witness. During manic episodes, she would become agitated and make decisions that seemed irrational to others. During depressive periods, she would withdraw completely, sometimes for days at a time. The couple's relationship was marked by intense highs and lows that reflected Sherilyn's bipolar condition. Neighbours and family members reported that their interactions could be loving and normal one day, then filled with shouting and bizarre behaviour the next. This instability created an environment where little Madison learned to navigate the unpredictable moods of her parents, developing a maturity beyond her years. Family relationships had become increasingly strained, particularly between Bobby and his father, Bob Dean Jamison. The two men had been engaged in a bitter legal dispute that had consumed much of Bobby's mental energy in the months leading up to October 2009. Bobby had filed a lawsuit against his father, claiming that the older man had threatened his family and was trying to harm them. The lawsuit detailed Bobby's belief that his father posed a real danger to him, Sherilyn, and Madison. This family conflict added another layer of stress to an already fragile household. The psychological pressure on the family was evident in their increasingly isolated lifestyle. Bobby had removed Madison from school, threatening to sue the school system for reasons that were never clearly explained. This decision left the 6-year-old without the social interaction and stability that school provides, further isolating her within the family unit. With neither parent working and Madison no longer attending school, the three spent most of their time together in their home, creating an insular environment where any problems or delusions could intensify without outside intervention. Friends and extended family members noticed changes in Bobby and Sherilyn's behaviour in the months before their disappearance. They spoke frequently about spirits haunting their house, claiming to have conversations with these entities. Some family members believed this was related to Sherilyn's mental health condition, while others wondered if Bobby was also experiencing psychological issues. The couple's discussions about supernatural phenomena became increasingly frequent and detailed, suggesting they were living in a reality that differed significantly from that of those around them. The decision to look for property in the remote San Bois Mountains seemed to represent the family's desire to escape from whatever was troubling them. They had been talking about buying land and possibly building a house away from civilization. For Bobby, this might have represented a chance to start fresh, away from the legal battle with his father and the pressures of their current life. For Sherilyn, it might have seemed like an opportunity to find peace from the mental turmoil that plagued her daily existence. On October 8, 2009, the family loaded their pickup truck with supplies and drove toward the mountains. They brought with them $32,000 in cash, an unusually large amount of money that they had somehow accumulated despite both being on disability. The presence of this money would later fuel speculation about their activities and the reason for their disappearance. But those who knew the family insisted they were not involved in any illegal activities. The emotional impact of their disappearance was immediate and devastating for the extended family members who had been trying to maintain contact with Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison, despite the family's increasing isolation. Bobby's mother, who had been concerned about her son's deteriorating mental state, found herself suddenly without answers about what had happened to her son and granddaughter. Sherilyn's family members, who had watched her struggle with bipolar disorder for years, were left wondering if her mental health had finally led to a tragic outcome. The discovery of their abandoned truck 8 days later, with the family's belongings still inside but the family nowhere to be found, created a sense of dread among those who loved them. The truck was found unlocked with the keys inside, their cell phones still on the dashboard, and their dog Maisie alive but distressed. The scene suggested that the family had left the vehicle voluntarily, but the question of why they would walk into the wilderness without their belongings haunted their relatives. For 4 years, family members lived with the uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to Bobby, Sherilyn, and little Madison. The not knowing was perhaps more painful than closure might have been. Every time the phone rang, every time there was a knock at the door, family members wondered if it might be news about their missing loved ones. The anniversary of their disappearance became an annual reminder of their absence, a day when the pain felt as fresh as it had on October 8, 2009. The psychological profile of the family that emerged during the investigation painted a picture of people struggling with significant mental health challenges, financial stress, and family conflict. Bobby's chronic pain had changed him from the man his family remembered, making him more suspicious and paranoid. Sherilyn's bipolar disorder had been inadequately managed, leading to episodes that frightened those around her. Madison, caught between her parents' struggles, had been removed from the normal childhood experiences that might have provided her with stability and support. Mental health professionals who studied the case noted that the combination of Bobby's pain-related psychological changes and Sherilyn's bipolar disorder could have created a shared delusion or folie à deux, where both parents began to believe in the same unrealistic threats or supernatural experiences. This shared psychological state might have influenced their decision-making in ways that led them to make choices that seemed rational to them but appeared dangerous to others. The discovery of their skeletal remains in November 2013, less than 3 miles from where their truck had been found, brought some closure to their family members, but also raised new questions. The remains were found face down in a line, suggesting they had been walking together when they died. The lack of clothing and the positioning of the bodies indicated they had been dead for several years, likely since shortly after their disappearance. The autopsy results were inconclusive due to the decomposition of the remains, but the manner of death was ruled a homicide. This classification meant that investigators believed the family had been killed by another person, rather than dying from natural causes, accident, or suicide. However, the lack of physical evidence meant that the identity of their killer remained unknown. The psychological impact of this conclusion was profound for family members who had spent 4 years wondering if their loved ones might still be alive somewhere. The confirmation that Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison had been murdered transformed their grief from the uncertain pain of missing persons to the specific anguish of knowing their family members had been victims of violence. The case highlighted the vulnerability of families struggling with mental health issues, particularly those who had become isolated from their support systems. The Jamison family's story became a reminder of how quickly people can disappear, especially when they are dealing with psychological challenges that affect their judgment and decision-making abilities. Their deaths also underscored the importance of mental health treatment and family support systems in preventing tragic outcomes. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, 2014. At 6:30 a.m. on March 8, 2014, families began gathering at Beijing Capital International Airport. They waited for loved ones arriving on Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 from Kuala Lumpur. The flight was supposed to land at 6:30 a.m. local time, but as minutes ticked by, the arrivals board showed only one word: delayed. What no one knew yet was that the Boeing 777 carrying 239 people had vanished from radar screens hours earlier, somewhere over the South China Sea. The first indication something was wrong came at 2:40 a.m. Malaysia time. Air traffic controllers in Kuala Lumpur tried to contact Flight 370 as it approached the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace. There was no response. The plane had simply disappeared from primary radar. No distress call, no emergency signal, just silence. By dawn, rescue teams were scrambling across the South China Sea. Ships and aircraft from Malaysia, Vietnam, and China began searching the waters east of the Malaysian peninsula. They were looking in the wrong place. Unknown to everyone at the time, Flight 370 had already been flying for hours in the opposite direction, deep into the Indian Ocean. The investigation that followed would become one of the most complex aviation mysteries in history. It would span continents, involve dozens of countries, and cost over $200 million. Yet 10 years later, the main wreckage of MH370 has never been found. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Inmarsat, a British satellite communications company, had been automatically receiving signals from Flight 370's engine monitoring system. These weren't voice communications or data transmissions that anyone had requested. They were simply routine handshake things between the aircraft and the satellite, occurring roughly every hour. Kris McLaughlin, Senior Vice President at Inmarsat, would later tell investigators that these pings were like breadcrumbs left by the aircraft. The signals showed that Flight 370 had continued flying for nearly 7 hours after it disappeared from radar. More importantly, the pings could be analysed to determine the aircraft's approximate location at each transmission. The satellite data revealed a shocking truth. After vanishing from radar over the South China Sea, Flight 370 had turned around. It flew back across the Malay Peninsula, then turned south into the Indian Ocean. The aircraft had flown for thousands of miles in the wrong direction, burning fuel until it ran out somewhere in the remote southern Indian Ocean. Peter Foley, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau's Director of Aviation Safety Investigations, led the technical analysis of the satellite data. His team worked with Inmarsat to create mathematical models that could predict where the aircraft might have crashed. The process was painstaking and unprecedented in aviation history. We were essentially trying to solve a puzzle with very few pieces, Foley explained to investigators. The satellite pings provided distance measurements from the aircraft to the satellite, creating rings of possible positions. But determining which point along each ring the aircraft had actually been required complex mathematical analysis. The satellite data showed that Flight 370 had flown in a generally southern direction after its final turn over the Indian Ocean. But the exact flight path remained uncertain. The aircraft could have crashed anywhere along a vast arc stretching from Kazakhstan to the southern Indian Ocean. Malaysian authorities initially struggled to coordinate the investigation. The country had little experience with large-scale aviation disasters, and the international nature of the incident complicated matters. Families of the missing passengers grew increasingly frustrated with the lack of clear information. Angus Houston, the former Australian Defence Chief who coordinated the international search effort, described the challenge. "We were looking for a needle in a haystack, but we didn't even know which haystack to look in. The search began with ships and aircraft scanning the ocean surface for debris. For weeks, satellites spotted possible wreckage floating in the Indian Ocean. Each time, search teams rushed to investigate, only to find fishing nets, shipping containers, or natural debris. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. On July 29, 2015, more than a year after the disappearance, a man cleaning a beach on Reunion Island found a large piece of aircraft debris. The curved metal fragment was about 6 feet long and appeared to be part of an aircraft wing. Aviation experts immediately recognized it as a flaperon, a control surface from the trailing edge of an aircraft wing. Serial numbers on the part confirmed it came from Flight 370. For the first time since the disappearance, investigators had physical evidence of what had happened to the aircraft. The flaperon was sent to a laboratory in France for detailed analysis. Investigators examined every inch of the debris, looking for clues about how the aircraft had crashed. The damage pattern suggested the aircraft had hit the water at high speed, but the exact circumstances remained unclear. More debris began washing ashore across the western Indian Ocean. Pieces of the aircraft were found on beaches in Mozambique, South Africa, Madagascar and Mauritius. Each fragment was carefully analysed, providing additional clues about the aircraft's final moments. Blaine Gibson, an American lawyer who became an amateur investigator, found several pieces of MH370 debris during his own searches along Indian Ocean coastlines. His discoveries helped investigators map the drift patterns of wreckage and refine their understanding of where the aircraft might have crashed. The ocean search focused on a 120,000 square kilometre area of the southern Indian Ocean, about 1,800 kilometres southwest of Perth, Australia. The search zone was determined by analysis of the satellite data and ocean current models that predicted where debris would drift. The underwater search presented enormous technical challenges. The ocean in the search area was over 4,000 metres deep, with rugged underwater terrain including mountains, valleys and deep trenches. The search teams used sophisticated sonar equipment and underwater vehicles to scan the seabed. Martin Dolan, Chief Commissioner of the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, oversaw the underwater search. His teams worked around the clock, battling rough seas and technical equipment failures. The search vessels covered an area larger than many countries, creating detailed maps of the ocean floor in the process. Despite 3 years of intensive searching, the main wreckage of Flight 370 was never found. The official search was suspended in January 2017, having cost over $200 million and involving thousands of personnel from multiple countries. The investigation team, led by Malaysian authorities, released their final report in 2018. The report concluded that the aircraft's communications systems had been deliberately disabled and that the aircraft had been flown manually off course. However, investigators could not determine who had been responsible or what their motives might have been. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, the aircraft's pilot, came under scrutiny when investigators found that he had practiced flying a similar route on his home flight simulator. The simulated flight ended in the southern Indian Ocean, in the same general area where Flight 370 was believed to have crashed. Some experts, including veteran airline pilot Simon Hardy, analysed the aircraft's flight path and concluded that it showed signs of deliberate control. Hardy argued that the aircraft's turns and altitude changes were too precise to be the result of mechanical failure or uncontrolled flight. Other investigators disagreed. They pointed out that the evidence against the pilot was circumstantial and that other explanations for the disappearance remained possible. The investigation had failed to find conclusive evidence of what had happened in the cockpit during the aircraft's final hours. The families of the 239 people aboard Flight 370 continued to seek answers. Many refused to accept that their loved ones were dead without seeing physical evidence. The lack of a clear explanation for the disappearance left them in a state of perpetual uncertainty. In 2018, a new search began. Ocean Infinity, a marine robotics company, launched a private search using cutting-edge underwater vehicles. The company searched an additional 112,000 square kilometers of ocean floor, but again found no trace of the main wreckage. The MH370 investigation revolutionized aviation safety protocols. Airlines now track aircraft more frequently, and new systems ensure that aircraft cannot simply vanish from radar without explanation. The tragedy led to improved satellite tracking and better coordination between countries during aviation emergencies. Independent investigators continue to analyze the available evidence, proposing new theories about what might have happened to Flight 370. Some focus on potential mechanical failures that could have incapacitated the crew. Others examine the possibility of hijacking or cyber attacks on the aircraft's systems. The debris analysis has provided important insights into the aircraft's final moments. The damage patterns suggest the aircraft hit the water with significant force, but not in a steep dive. This finding has led some experts to conclude that someone was still controlling the aircraft during its final descent. Recent developments have renewed hope for solving the mystery. In 2024, Malaysia announced it was considering a new search proposal from Ocean Infinity. The company claims to have identified a new target area based on analysis of the satellite data and debris drift patterns. The technology available for underwater searches has improved dramatically since the original search. New autonomous underwater vehicles can search larger areas more efficiently, and improved sonar systems can detect smaller objects on the ocean floor. Whatever happened to Flight 370, the investigation has shown both the capabilities and limitations of modern aviation safety systems. While aircraft are tracked more closely today than in 2014, the basic mystery remains unsolved. Somewhere in the Indian Ocean, the answers to what happened on March 8, 2014, lie waiting to be discovered. The search for MH370 continues to this day, driven by the determination of families who refuse to give up hope and investigators who believe the truth can still be found. Each new piece of evidence, each refined analysis of the satellite data, brings the investigation one step closer to finally solving one of aviation's greatest mysteries. The Dyatlov Pass incident, 1959. The railway platform at Sverdlovsk station buzzed with the usual activity on the evening of January 23, 1959. Among the passengers boarding the overnight train to Ivdel were 10 young people weighted down with heavy backpacks and cross-country skis. They laughed and chatted as they settled into their sleeper car, excited about the adventure ahead. Led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, a fifth-year engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute, this group of experienced hikers was embarking on what they hoped would be the skiing expedition of their lives. The plan was ambitious but achievable for such skilled outdoor enthusiasts. They would trek 190 miles through the northern Ural Mountains to reach Mount Torton, a journey that would earn them the higher certification in Soviet mountaineering. The route would take them through some of the most remote and challenging terrain in the region, but every member of the group was experienced in winter survival and mountain hiking. As the train pulled away from Sverdlovsk that night, none of the passengers could have imagined that within 10 days, 9 of them would be dead in circumstances so bizarre that the incident would become one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. January 24th, 1959. The train arrived in Ivdel, a small town that served as the gateway to the northern Urals. The group spent the day organising their equipment and purchasing additional supplies. They planned to spend the night in town before beginning their trek the following morning. The weather was cold but clear, perfect conditions for the start of their journey. January 25th, 1959. The hikers boarded a truck that would take them to Vizhai, the last settlement before the wilderness. Vizhai was a small logging town inhabited primarily by Mansi people, the indigenous inhabitants of the region. The truck driver later recalled that the group was in high spirits, singing songs and making jokes during the bumpy ride through the snowy landscape. In Vizhai, the hikers met with local guides and gathered final information about the route ahead. They learned that the weather in the mountains had been particularly harsh that winter, with temperatures dropping well below normal and frequent snowstorms. Despite these warnings, the group was confident in their abilities and eager to begin the real adventure. January 26, 1959. The group left Vizhai on foot, pulling their heavy sleds behind them as they skied north toward the mountains. The terrain was initially manageable, following well-travelled paths through the forest. They made good progress despite the deep snow, covering several miles before setting up their first wilderness camp. That evening, as they gathered around their campfire, the hikers were in excellent spirits. They took photographs, wrote in their diaries, and planned the next day's route. The group dynamics were strong, with Igor Dyatlov proving to be a capable and respected leader. Nobody complained about the cold or the challenging conditions ahead. January 27, 1959. The second day of hiking proved more difficult. The terrain became increasingly mountainous, and the snow was deeper than expected. The group had to work together to haul their sleds up steep slopes and navigate through dense forest. Despite the physical demands, they maintained their enthusiasm and covered reasonable ground. During this day, the group encountered their first significant challenge. Yuri Yudin, one of the 10 hikers, began experiencing severe back pain and cold symptoms. By evening, it was clear that he would not be able to continue with the expedition. The decision was made that Yudin would return to Vizhai the next morning, while the remaining 9 members continued toward Mount Torton. January 28, 1959. The group said goodbye to Yuri Yudin, who began his journey back to civilization. This seemingly minor event would later prove to be the most crucial moment of the entire expedition. Yudin was the only member of the original group who had survived to tell the story of their preparations and the mood of the team. The remaining 9 hikers continued deeper into the wilderness. The weather was deteriorating with increasing wind and snowfall. The group's progress slowed significantly as they struggled to maintain their route in the worsening conditions. They were now completely isolated from the outside world, with no means of communication and no expected contact with civilization until their scheduled return. January 29th, 1959. The hikers faced their most challenging day yet. The weather had turned severe, with strong winds and heavy snowfall making navigation extremely difficult. The group was forced to make several detours to avoid the worst of the storm conditions. Despite these setbacks, they pressed on, determined to maintain their schedule. The photographs from this day show the group members bundled against the cold but still smiling and apparently in good spirits. They were experienced enough to know that harsh weather was part of mountain hiking, and they had the skills and equipment to handle difficult conditions. January 30th, 1959. The expedition continued through increasingly challenging terrain. The group was now well into the mountains, far from any human habitation. The snow was deeper than they had anticipated, and the weather remained unpredictable. They were forced to cache some of their supplies to reduce the weight they were carrying. The group's diary entries from this period reveal no unusual concerns or fears. They wrote about the beautiful but harsh landscape, the physical demands of the journey, and their anticipation of reaching Mount Autorten. There were no mentions of strange sightings, unusual sounds, or any other phenomena that might have caused alarm. January 31st, 1959. The group made final preparations for the most challenging part of their journey. They were now approaching the high passes that would take them to Mount Autorten. The weather was particularly harsh, with temperatures dropping well below zero and strong winds making conditions dangerous for exposed travel. February 1st, 1959. This was the day that would become central to the mystery. The group began their final approach to Mount Autorten, but the weather was so severe that they were forced to change their plans. Instead of continuing to their intended destination, they decided to set up camp on the eastern slope of a mountain the local Mansi people called Kholat Syakhl, meaning Dead Mountain. The decision to camp on the exposed slope was unusual for such experienced hikers. Normally, they would have sought shelter in the forest below or found a more protected location, but the evidence suggests they were trying to avoid losing altitude and were confident they could handle one night in the exposed position. The group set up their tent on the snowy slope as the daylight faded. The last photographs from their cameras show them cutting blocks of snow to create a windbreak around their campsite. They appeared to be in good spirits despite the harsh conditions. The final photograph shows the tent being erected against the darkening sky. February 2nd, 1959. At some point during the night, something happened that caused 9 experienced hikers to cut their way out of their tent and flee into the minus 30-degree cold, many of them barefoot or in their underwear. Whatever it was urgent enough to make them abandon their only shelter and venture into conditions that would kill them within hours. The tent was found weeks later, still standing but severely damaged. It had been cut open from the inside, with clean slashes made by knives or similar sharp objects. The hikers' boots, warm clothing and survival equipment were all left inside. Outside the tent, investigators found footprints in the snow, showing that the group had walked calmly, not run, away from their shelter. The footprints led downhill toward a line of trees about 1,500 meters from the tent. Some of the prints were made by bare feet, others by feet wearing only socks. The prints showed no signs of panic or struggle. The hikers had walked in an organized group, not scattered in terror. February 6th, 1959. This was the day the group was scheduled to return to Sverdlovsk. When they failed to appear, their families and friends initially were not concerned. Delays were common in mountain expeditions, especially during harsh weather. It would be several more days before anyone realized something was seriously wrong. February 20th, 1959. Nearly 3 weeks after the group's disappearance, a search and rescue operation was finally launched. The delay had been caused by bureaucratic confusion and the assumption that the experienced hikers were simply delayed by bad weather. When the search began, it involved hundreds of volunteers, police, military personnel and aircraft. February 26th, 1959. The search team found the tent. Student volunteer Mikhail Sharaven was the first to spot the collapsed orange fabric against the white snow. What he and his fellow searchers discovered would baffle investigators for decades to come. The tent was still partially standing, weighed down by snow and ice. It had been cut open from the inside with deliberate, clean cuts. All of the hikers' essential survival gear was still inside, including their boots, warm clothing and food. There were no signs of a struggle inside the tent, and no evidence of what might have caused the group to abandon their shelter so abruptly. The search team followed the footprints down the slope toward the forest. The prints told a strange story. The hikers had left the tent in an organized manner, walking calmly rather than running. Some wore minimal footwear, others were barefoot. The prints suggested the group had stayed together as they moved away from their camp. At the forest edge, searchers found the remains of a small fire and the bodies of Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko. Both men were found near the remnants of a cedar tree, with branches broken off up to 5 meters high, suggesting someone had climbed the tree. The men were barely clothed and had died of hypothermia. Their hands were badly cut, apparently from climbing the tree with bare hands. Between the tent and the cedar tree, searchers found the body of Igor Dyatlov, the group's leader. He was found lying on his back, facing the tent, as if he had been trying to return to the shelter. Like the others, he was inadequately dressed for the conditions and had died of hypothermia. 2 more bodies were discovered in the following days. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found about 330 meters from the cedar tree, also lying face down in the snow. Rustem Slobodin was found between her and Dyatlov. Both had died of hypothermia, and both appeared to have been trying to return to the tent when they collapsed. The search for the remaining 4 hikers continued for weeks. The bodies of Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Kolevatov were not found until May 4, 1959, when melting snow revealed their location in a ravine about 75 meters from the cedar tree. These 4 bodies presented a different and more disturbing picture. While the first 5 hikers had died of hypothermia with relatively minor injuries, these 4 had suffered massive trauma. Thibault-Brignol had suffered a major skull fracture. Dubinina and Zolotaryov had multiple broken ribs and severe chest injuries. Most mysteriously, Dubinina was found without her tongue and eyes. The injuries to the final 4 victims were so severe that the medical examiner compared them to those that would result from a car crash or explosion. The force required to inflict such damage would have been enormous, yet there were no external wounds or signs of a struggle. The bodies showed no traces of radioactivity, despite some early rumours. The investigation officially concluded that the deaths were caused by a compelling natural force that the hikers were unable to overcome. This vague explanation satisfied no one and only added to the mystery. The case files were sealed, and the area was closed to hikers and researchers for years. The Dyatlov Pass incident, as it came to be known, has inspired countless theories and investigations. The basic facts remain unchanged. 9 experienced hikers died in circumstances that seem to defy logical explanation. They had abandoned their shelter in deadly cold for reasons that remain unclear, and some had suffered injuries that appeared impossible to explain through conventional means. The photographs, diary entries, and physical evidence from the scene have been analysed countless times, but the mystery remains unsolved. The incident has become a touchstone for unexplained phenomena, generating theories ranging from avalanches to military accidents to supernatural causes. Each theory attempts to explain the evidence, but none has been able to account for all the strange details of that night on Dead Mountain. The Yuba County 5, 1978. In the realm of unexplained disappearances, certain cases transcend their geographical boundaries and time periods to become part of a darker pattern that haunts investigators worldwide. When 5 friends from Yuba County, California, vanished on a snowy February night in 1978, the similarities to a tragedy that had occurred nearly 2 decades earlier on the other side of the world became impossible to ignore. The case of Gary Mathias, Jack Madruga, Ted Wyer, William Sterling, and Jack Hewitt would earn the nickname the American Dyatlov Pass, linking it forever to the mysterious deaths of 9 Russian hikers in the Ural Mountains in 1959. Both cases share a fundamental and disturbing pattern: groups of people abandoning safety and shelter to face certain death in freezing conditions, apparently of their own free will. This parallel has led researchers to examine not just the individual mysteries, but the broader implications of what might cause rational human beings to make such fatal decisions. The Yuba County 5 consisted of men between the ages of 24 and 32, all living with mild intellectual disabilities or psychiatric conditions. On February 24, 1978, they drove 50 miles from their homes in Yuba City to Chico to watch their favourite college basketball team play. This was a routine they had followed many times before, and they were familiar with the route. After the game, they began the drive home in Jack Madruga's 1969 Mercury Montego, a reliable vehicle that Madruga maintained meticulously. The parallels to the Dyatlov Pass incident begin with the fundamental question that haunts both cases: why would people abandon safety for certain death? In the Russian case, 9 experienced hikers cut their way out of their tent and fled into -30-degree temperatures wearing minimal clothing. In California, 5 men abandoned a warm, functioning car on a snowy mountain road and walked into the wilderness in street clothes, never to return alive. The discovery of the Yuba County 5's car provides the first striking similarity to the Dyatlov case. Just as the Russian hiker's tent was found intact with all their survival gear inside, the Mercury Montego was discovered undamaged on a remote mountain road, 70 miles from where the men should have been. The car was not stuck, damaged, or out of fuel. The keys were missing, but the vehicle could have been started without them. Most puzzling of all, the car's interior showed no signs of struggle or distress. This pattern of abandoned shelter echoes a broader phenomenon observed in multiple disappearance cases across different continents and time periods. The abandonment of safety appears to be a recurring theme in group disappearances, suggesting underlying psychological or environmental factors that researchers are only beginning to understand. The location where both groups met their fate adds another layer to the comparative analysis. The Dyatlov Pass incident occurred in the remote Ural Mountains, an area the local Mansi people called Dead Mountain. The Yuba County Five's ordeal unfolded in the Sierra Nevada mountains, in an area known for its harsh winter conditions and treacherous terrain. Both locations were far from civilization, places where survival would be nearly impossible without proper preparation and equipment. The timeline of events in both cases reveals a similar pattern of progressive deterioration. In the Dyatlov case, the hikers' bodies were found at different distances from their tent, suggesting they had tried to return to safety but succumbed to the elements at various points. The Yuba County Five followed a remarkably similar pattern. Their bodies were discovered at different locations, with evidence suggesting they had initially stayed together before becoming separated in the harsh conditions. The discovery of the first victim in the Yuba County case, Ted Vaiher, provides perhaps the most disturbing parallel to the Dyatlov incident. Vaiher was found 4 months after the disappearance in a remote Forest Service trailer, having survived for an estimated 8 to 13 weeks in the wilderness. The trailer was stocked with food, had a functioning heater, and even contained matches. Yet Vaiher had lost between 80 and 100 pounds and had severe frostbite on his feet. Most puzzling of all, he had apparently made no attempt to light the heater or access most of the available food. This behaviour mirrors the seemingly irrational actions of the Dyatlov hikers, who had the skills and equipment to survive, but appeared to make decisions that hastened their deaths. The pattern suggests a psychological state that researchers have begun to study in relation to extreme stress and survival situations. The condition of the victims' bodies in both cases raises questions about the nature of their final hours. The Dyatlov hikers were found in various states of undress, having apparently removed clothing despite the deadly cold. Similarly, the Yuba County Five were found without adequate clothing for the conditions, despite having access to warmer garments. This phenomenon, known as paradoxical undressing, occurs in severe hypothermia cases but doesn't explain the initial decision to abandon safety. The psychological profiles of the victims in both cases add another dimension to the comparative analysis. The Dyatlov hikers were experienced mountaineers who understood the dangers of their environment. The Yuba County Five, while living with intellectual disabilities, were familiar with their local area and had no history of impulsive or dangerous behaviour. Both groups consisted of people who would not normally be expected to make such catastrophic decisions. The investigation patterns in both cases reveal similar challenges faced by authorities when dealing with such anomalous events. In both instances, initial searches focused on conventional explanations: avalanches, accidents, or criminal activity. When these explanations proved inadequate, investigators were left with scenarios that seemed to defy logical explanation. The media coverage of both cases has contributed to their enduring mystery status. The Dyatlov Pass incident has generated countless theories ranging from military accidents to supernatural phenomena. The Yuba County Five case has similarly spawned numerous explanations, from drug-induced panic to encounters with unknown forces. The fact that both cases resist conventional explanation has made them touchstones for researchers studying unexplained phenomena. The environmental conditions in both cases suggest that extreme weather may play a role in these mysterious group behaviours. Both incidents occurred during harsh winter conditions, with heavy snow, low temperatures, and limited visibility. Some researchers have theorized that certain atmospheric conditions might affect human psychology in ways that are not yet fully understood. The discovery of additional evidence in both cases has only deepened the mystery. In the Dyatlov case, the finding of the final 4 victims with severe internal injuries raised questions about what force could have caused such trauma. In the Yuba County case, the discovery of Gary Mathias's shoes and jacket miles from where the car was found suggested the men had travelled much further than initially believed. The timeline of discoveries in both cases reveals how these mysteries evolve over time. The Dyatlov hikers' bodies were found over a period of months, with each discovery adding new questions rather than answers. The Yuba County Five followed a similar pattern, with Viha's body found first, followed by the discovery of 3 more victims, while Gary Mathias has never been found. The impact of these cases on local communities demonstrates another parallel. Both incidents have become part of local folklore, with the areas where they occurred taking on an ominous reputation. The Dyatlov Pass was closed to hikers for years after the incident, while the area where the Yuba County Five disappeared has become synonymous with unexplained phenomena. The families of the victims in both cases have faced similar challenges in seeking answers. The lack of clear explanations has left them unable to find closure, while the public fascination with the mysteries has sometimes overshadowed the human tragedy involved. This pattern is common in high-profile disappearance cases that capture public imagination. The scientific community has approached both cases with increasing interest as researchers seek to understand the psychological and environmental factors that might contribute to such events. Studies of group psychology, survival behavior, and environmental influences on human decision-making have all been informed by these cases. The technological advances since these incidents have provided new tools for investigation, but they have also revealed the limitations of forensic science when dealing with such complex scenarios. Modern search techniques, DNA analysis, and psychological profiling have all been applied to these cases, yet the fundamental questions remain unanswered. The comparative analysis of these cases has led to the identification of other similar incidents worldwide. Researchers have found patterns of group disappearances that share common elements: the abandonment of safety, the separation of group members, and the apparent inability to make rational survival decisions. These patterns suggest that the Dyatlov Pass and Yuba County Five cases may be part of a broader phenomenon that spans cultures and time periods. D.B. Cooper hijacking, 1971. The afternoon of November 24, 1971, was bustling with Thanksgiving Eve travellers at Portland International Airport. Families hurried through the terminals laden with luggage and gifts, eager to reach their holiday destinations. Among the crowd, one passenger stood out for his complete lack of urgency. He approached the Northwest Orient Airlines counter at approximately 2:50 p.m., wearing a business suit, white shirt, black tie, and loafers. He carried a briefcase and a brown paper bag. When the ticket agent asked for his name, he replied simply, "Dan Cooper." Cooper purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle for $20, paying in cash. The flight was scheduled to take just 30 minutes, a routine hop between 2 major Pacific Northwest cities. Cooper seemed like any other businessman making the short journey north. He spoke politely to the airline staff, showed no signs of nervousness, and appeared to be in no particular hurry. Northwest Orient Flight 305 was a Boeing 727, 100, one of the most common aircraft in commercial aviation at the time. The plane could carry 131 passengers, but on this Thanksgiving Eve flight only 36 people were aboard, including Cooper. The aircraft was equipped with aft stairs that could be lowered during flight, a feature that would prove crucial to the events that followed. Cooper boarded the aircraft and walked to the rear, taking seat 18E, one of the last rows. He settled in quietly, declining the flight attendant's offer of a pre-flight beverage. As other passengers found their seats, Cooper opened his briefcase and began what appeared to be routine paperwork. Nothing about his demeanour suggested the extraordinary events that were about to unfold. The aircraft pushed back from the gate at 2:50 p.m. and taxied to the runway. Captain William Scott, First Officer William Ratatzak, and Flight Engineer Harold Anderson went through their standard pre-flight procedures. The weather was overcast with light rain, typical for Portland in late November. As the Boeing 727 climbed into the grey sky, Cooper continued reading his papers, seemingly oblivious to the other passengers and crew. At approximately 3 p.m., about 10 minutes after takeoff, Cooper beckoned to Florence Schaffner, the nearest flight attendant. Schaffner was 23 years old and had been working for Northwest Orient for less than 2 years. She dealt with the usual array of passenger requests and occasionally inappropriate behaviour from male passengers. When Cooper quietly told her he had a bomb, she initially thought it was just another unwelcome advance from a businessman. Cooper's calm demeanour began to register with Schaffner. He wasn't making crude jokes or trying to get her attention in the usual ways. His voice was steady, his manner serious. When she didn't immediately respond, Cooper opened his briefcase slightly and showed her the contents. Inside, she could see red cylinders, wires, and what appeared to be a battery. The device looked exactly like the bombs she had seen in movies and television shows. "I want you to sit down," Cooper said calmly. Schaffner took the seat beside him, her training taking over despite her shock. Cooper's instructions were clear and delivered in a conversational tone. He wanted her to write down his demands exactly as he stated them. His voice never rose above a normal speaking volume, and he maintained the polite demeanour he had shown since boarding. Cooper's demands were specific and well thought out. He wanted $200,000 in $20 bills, 4 parachutes and fuel trucks standing by in Seattle. The money was to be delivered in a cloth bag, and the parachutes were to be civilian sport parachutes, not military surplus. The precision of his requests suggested considerable planning and knowledge of both aviation procedures and parachuting equipment. At 3:07 p.m, Schaffner carried Cooper's note to the cockpit. Captain Scott immediately contacted Seattle Air Traffic Control to report the hijacking. The crew's primary concern was the safety of the passengers and crew. They had no way of knowing whether Cooper's bomb was real or fake, but they could not afford to take chances. The FBI was notified immediately, and agents began coordinating with Northwest Orient officials to meet Cooper's demands. The airline's management made the decision to comply, fully with the hijackers' requests. In 1971, this was standard procedure for hijacking situations. The priority was to avoid violence and protect lives, even if it meant paying ransom to criminals. Cooper remained calm throughout the 30-minute flight to Seattle. He ordered a bourbon and soda from Schaffner and lit a cigarette, both of which were legal on aircraft in 1971. He engaged in casual conversation with Schaffner about her work and her life, showing genuine interest in her responses. Other passengers later reported that they had no idea anything unusual was happening. The Boeing 727 landed at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport at 5:24 p.m. Cooper had instructed the crew to taxi to a remote area of the airport, away from the main terminals. The aircraft stopped on a taxiway, and Cooper allowed the 36 passengers to disembark. He insisted that Schaffner and the other 2 flight attendants remain aboard, along with the 3-man flight crew. At 5:45 p.m, an FBI agent approached the aircraft carrying a cloth bag containing $200,000 in $20 bills. The money had been assembled by Seattle First National Bank, and each bill's serial number had been recorded by bank employees. The FBI had also arranged for 4 civilian parachutes to be delivered to the aircraft. 2 were primary parachutes and 2 were reserves. Cooper examined the money carefully, using a magnifying glass to check the bills. He seemed satisfied that the bank had met his demands exactly as specified. He then inspected the parachutes, demonstrating knowledge of their construction and operation. He selected one of the primary parachutes and one of the reserves, rejecting the other 2. After receiving the money and parachutes, Cooper released the flight attendants except for Schaffner, whom he kept as insurance. He then gave the crew new instructions for the next phase of his plan. They were to fly to Mexico City, but with specific flight parameters: landing gear down, flaps at 15 degrees, and a speed of no more than 200 knots. The crew recognized that these settings would create maximum drag and reduce fuel efficiency. At 7:36 p.m, Flight 305 took off from Seattle for the second time. Cooper had chosen a flight path that would take the aircraft southeast over southwestern Washington. The weather had deteriorated significantly, with heavy rain and strong winds. The aircraft flew at 10,000 feet, much lower than the normal cruising altitude for a Boeing 727. Cooper's choice of flight conditions was tactically sound. The low altitude and slow speed would make the aircraft easier to jump from, while the bad weather would reduce visibility for any pursuing aircraft. The heavy rain would also make it difficult for ground observers to track his descent after he jumped. During the flight south, Cooper tied the money bag around his waist and put on the parachute. He'd given precise instructions to the crew about the aircraft's configuration, showing detailed knowledge of the Boeing 727's capabilities. He knew that the aft stairs could be lowered during flight, something that most passengers would never have known. At approximately 8 p.m, Cooper instructed Schaffner to join the rest of the crew in the cockpit and close the door behind her. He said he would handle the rest of the operation alone. The crew heard him moving around in the cabin, presumably preparing for his jump. They felt a slight upward movement of the aircraft's tail section, indicating that someone had lowered the aft stairs. The aircraft was flying over the dense forests of southwestern Washington, an area known for its rugged terrain and thick canopy of Douglas fir trees. The weather conditions were severe, with heavy rain, strong winds, and temperatures near freezing. Visibility was close to zero, and the terrain below was virtually uninhabited. At 8:13 p.m, the crew felt a sudden upward movement of the aircraft's tail section. This was the aerodynamic effect of Cooper's departure from the aircraft. The tail section lifted slightly as Cooper and his parachute created drag and then suddenly released. The crew knew immediately that the hijacker had jumped. Captain Scott continued flying the predetermined route toward Mexico City for several more minutes before receiving permission to return to Seattle. The crew conducted a thorough search of the aircraft and found no trace of Cooper except for his black tie, which he had removed before jumping. The tie became one of the few pieces of physical evidence left behind. The FBI launched an immediate search and rescue operation, despite the poor weather conditions. Search teams combed the forests of southwestern Washington, looking for any sign of Cooper or his parachute. The difficult terrain and dense forest canopy made the search extremely challenging. Helicopters and ground teams worked through the night, but found no trace of the hijacker. The area where Cooper jumped was some of the most inhospitable terrain in the Pacific Northwest. The forests were thick with underbrush, and the terrain was cut by deep ravines and steep ridges. In November, the weather was cold and wet, with temperatures that could kill an unprepared person within hours. The chances of survival for someone landing in these conditions were extremely low. Cooper's choice of parachute equipment puzzled investigators. He had rejected 2 of the 4 parachutes provided, selecting ones that were more difficult to use but potentially more reliable. His knowledge of parachuting procedures suggested some level of experience, but experts debated whether he had enough skill to survive a night jump in such conditions. The FBI's investigation revealed that Cooper had planned his crime carefully. His demands were specific and showed knowledge of both aviation procedures and parachuting equipment. He had chosen a flight route that would take him over sparsely populated terrain, reducing the chances of witnesses or quick discovery. His timing on Thanksgiving Eve ensured that bank personnel would be available to assemble the ransom money. Cooper's polite demeanour throughout the hijacking earned him as a unique place in American criminal folklore. Passengers and crew members later described him as courteous and well-mannered, never raising his voice or showing anger. He had insisted on paying for his bourbon, tea and soda, and had expressed concern for the safety of the other passengers. The media coverage of the hijacking was extensive, and Cooper quickly became a folk hero to many Americans. His crime was seen as victimless, since no one was hurt and the money was insured. The fact that he had pulled off what appeared to be the perfect crime during the height of the airplane hijacking era captured public imagination. The FBI's search for Cooper became one of the longest-running investigations in the agency's history. Agents followed thousands of leads, interviewed hundreds of suspects, and analysed every piece of evidence recovered from the aircraft. The case generated massive public interest and spawned countless theories about Cooper's identity and fate. In 1980, an 8-year-old boy found $5,800 in deteriorating $20 bills along the Columbia River. The serial numbers matched those of the bills given to Cooper, providing the only confirmed trace of the ransom money ever recovered. The discovery raised more questions than it answered, as the bills appeared to have been exposed to the elements for years. The Cooper case highlighted weaknesses in aviation security that led to significant changes in airline procedures. Metal detectors became standard equipment at airports, and the design of aircraft was modified to prevent similar hijackings. The Boeing 727's aft stairs were equipped with Cooper vanes, devices that prevent the stairs from being lowered during flight. Over the decades, hundreds of people have claimed to be Cooper or to know his true identity. The FBI has investigated the most credible claims, but none have been conclusively proven. The case remains the only unsolved air piracy case in American history, a testament to Cooper's planning and the perfect storm of circumstances that allowed him to disappear. Ambrose Bierce disappearance, 1914. Some people disappear in an instant, vanishing without warning or explanation. Others seem to orchestrate their own disappearance, leaving behind a trail of clues and contradictions that reveal as much about their inner world as their outer circumstances. Ambrose Bierce belonged to the latter category. When the 71-year-old writer crossed into Mexico in late 1913, he was not just entering a country torn by revolution. He was walking into the final chapter of a life that had been haunted by death, loss, and an increasingly dark view of human nature. Born on June 24, 1842 in Meigs County, Ohio, Ambrose Bierce came from humble beginnings that would shape his cynical worldview. He was the 10th of 13 children born to Marcus Aurelius Bierce and Laura Sherwood Bierce. His father was a poor farmer who struggled to provide for his large family, and young Ambrose grew up in an atmosphere of financial hardship and emotional distance. The early death of several of his siblings exposed Bierce to mortality at a young age, an experience that would profoundly influence his later writing. His family's poverty meant that formal education was limited, but Bierce was a voracious reader who educated himself through books whenever he could find them. This self-taught literary foundation would later serve him well, but it also contributed to his lifelong sense of being an outsider looking in on society. At age 19, Bierce enlisted in the Union Army's 9th Indiana Infantry Regiment, beginning a chapter of his life that would define him forever. The Civil War was not just a historical event for Bierce, it was a personal crucible that burned away any romantic notions he might have had about human nature and heroism. He served with distinction, participating in some of the war's bloodiest battles, including Shiloh, Stones River, and Chickamauga. The war years revealed both Bierce's courage and his capacity for witnessing horror. He was wounded twice and rose to the rank of brevet major, but the psychological wounds ran deeper than the physical ones. The young man who had enlisted with typical patriotic fervour emerged from the war with a profound understanding of death's randomness and humanity's capacity for violence. These experiences would later inform his most famous works, including an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which captured the surreal nature of death in wartime. After the war, Bierce struggled to find his place in peacetime society. He briefly worked as a watchman at the US Treasury, but the mundane nature of civilian life left him restless and dissatisfied. In 1866, he joined a military expedition to California, where he would spend the most productive years of his career. The journey west represented both a geographical and psychological transition, a movement away from the scenes of his wartime trauma toward a new life that might allow him to process his experiences through writing. In California, Bierce found his calling as a journalist and writer. He worked for various newspapers, developing the sharp, satirical style that would make him famous. His weekly column, The Prattler, in the San Francisco Examiner, became required reading for the city's literary community. Bierce's wit was cutting and his observations about human nature were often cruel, but they were also perceptive. He had little patience for hypocrisy, sentimentality, or pretension. It was during this period that Bierce met Mary Ellen "Molly" Day, a well-connected San Francisco socialite who would become his wife. They married on Christmas Day 1871, when Bierce was 29 and Molly was 24. The marriage initially seemed to provide the stability that Bierce had been seeking. Molly came from a wealthy family and moved in sophisticated social circles, offering Bierce access to a world of cultural refinement that his impoverished background had denied him. The couple had 3 children: Day, born in 1872, Lee in 1874, and Helen in 1875. For a time, Bierce seemed to have found domestic happiness. He was building a reputation as a writer, his family was growing, and his financial situation was improving. However, the psychological scars of war and his inherently pessimistic nature made it difficult for him to fully embrace contentment. Bierce's relationship with his children was complex, reflecting his own emotional struggles. He was a devoted father in many ways, but he also imposed his high standards and cynical worldview on his sons. He expected them to be strong, self-reliant, and intellectually rigorous, qualities that he had developed through his own harsh experiences. This created pressure on Day and Lee, who struggled to live up to their father's expectations while dealing with their own psychological challenges. The first major crack in Bierce's family life came in 1888, when he discovered that Molly had been having an affair. The revelation devastated him, not just because of the betrayal, but because it confirmed his darkest suspicions about human nature. After 17 years of marriage, he separated from Molly, though they would not divorce until much later. The separation marked the beginning of a period of increasing isolation and bitterness for Bierce. The personal tragedy that would define Bierce's later years began in 1889 with the death of his son Day. The circumstances of Day's death were particularly painful for Bierce. Day had been involved in a romantic rivalry that led to a duel with his rival, Nell Hubble. During the confrontation, Day was shot and killed, dying in his father's arms. The loss of his eldest son was devastating for Bierce, who blamed himself for not being able to protect the young man. Day's death was followed by an even more prolonged agony with his younger son Lee. Lee struggled with alcoholism and depression, conditions that may have been exacerbated by the family's dysfunction and his father's demanding nature. Bierce watched helplessly as his son's life spiraled downward, unable to provide the emotional support that might have made a difference. In 1901, Lee died of pneumonia, but his alcoholism had weakened his constitution and contributed to his death. The loss of both his sons left Bierce emotionally shattered. He had already been prone to depression and cynicism, but the deaths of Day and Lee pushed him into a darker psychological state. He began to write obsessively about death, fate, and the meaninglessness of human existence. His stories became increasingly macabre, focusing on themes of mortality, supernatural horror, and the arbitrary nature of fortune. Bierce's writing during this period reflected his personal anguish. His most famous work, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, published in 1890, explored the psychological experience of death with haunting precision. The story's protagonist, facing execution during the Civil War, experiences an elaborate fantasy of escape in the moments before his death. The tale's twist ending, revealing that the entire escape sequence was a dying man's hallucination, reflected Bierce's understanding of how the mind copes with mortality. His collection Tales of Soldiers and Civilians, later retitled In the Midst of Life, established him as a master of the short story form, but the works were marked by an overwhelming sense of doom and futility. Critics praised his technical skill while noting the almost unbearable darkness of his vision. Bierce seemed to be working through his own trauma by creating fictional worlds where death was always lurking just beneath the surface of ordinary life. The death of Molly in 1904, just as their divorce was being finalised, added another layer of loss to Bierce's already heavy burden. Despite their separation and the bitterness that had developed between them, Molly had been a central figure in his life for over 3 decades. Her death left him truly alone, with only his daughter Helen remaining as the family. By 1913, Bierce was 71 years old and increasingly isolated. His literary reputation was secure, but he felt that his best work was behind him. The world around him was changing rapidly, and he struggled to find his place in the new century. The old certainties that had sustained him, his work, his family, his role as a literary figure, were all either gone or no longer fulfilling. It was in this state of mind that Bierce made the decision that would lead to his disappearance. In October 1913, he left Washington, D.C., where he had been working as a journalist, and began a journey through the southern states. His stated intention was to revisit the Civil War battlefields, where he had served as a young soldier, but his letters to friends and family suggested a deeper purpose. The letters Bierce wrote during this final journey reveal a man who was preparing for death. He settled his financial affairs, said goodbye to old friends, and spoke increasingly about his own mortality. To his niece Laura, he wrote, "It is my intention to go to Mexico. I have a strange fancy for the fighting in Mexico. I want to see how war is waged in a tropical country." Bierce's fascination with the Mexican Revolution was not just journalistic curiosity. It was a psychological need to return to the environment where he'd felt most alive. The Civil War had been the defining experience of his youth, and now, in his old age, he was drawn to another conflict that might provide the same intensity and meaning. The revolution offered him a chance to witness history in the making, and perhaps to find the honourable death that seemed to elude him in civilian life. His final letters home were filled with dark humour and fatalistic acceptance. To a friend he wrote, "Goodbye. If you hear of my being stood up against a Mexican stone wall and shot to rags, please know that I think that a pretty good way to depart this life. It beats old age, disease, or falling down the cellar stairs." The psychological profile that emerges from these final communications is of a man who had lost his will to live but wanted to choose the manner of his death. Bierce was not suicidal in the conventional sense. He was not planning to kill himself. Rather, he was seeking a situation where death might find him naturally, in circumstances that would give his life's end some dignity and meaning. When Bierce crossed into Mexico in late 1913 or early 1914, he was entering a country convulsed by revolution. The Mexican Revolution had been raging since 1910, with various factions fighting for control of the government. The conflict was particularly brutal, with summary executions, guerrilla warfare, and civilian casualties common. For a man seeking adventure and possibly death, it was the perfect destination. The impact of Bierce's disappearance on those who knew him was complex. His daughter Helen was devastated by the loss of her father, but she also understood his psychological state. She knew that he'd been deeply depressed since the deaths of her brothers, and that life had lost much of its meaning for him. In some ways, his disappearance into Mexico was consistent with the man he had become. Someone who preferred mystery and drama to the mundane realities of old age. The literary community mourned the loss of one of America's finest short story writers, but they also recognized that Bierce's disappearance was somehow fitting. He had always been fascinated by death and the unknown, and his vanishing into the chaos of revolutionary Mexico seemed like something from one of his own stories. The mystery of his fate became part of his legend, ensuring that he would be remembered not just for his writing but for the dramatic circumstances of his disappearance. The psychological dimensions of Bierce's disappearance continue to fascinate scholars and readers. His case illustrates how personal trauma, particularly the loss of children, can fundamentally alter a person's relationship with life and death. The man who had survived the Civil War and built a successful literary career was ultimately undone by the accumulated weight of personal loss, and the realization that his life's meaning had been exhausted. Bierce's story also reflects the broader psychological impact of war on those who survive it. His Civil War experiences had given him both the material for his greatest works and the emotional wounds that would never fully heal. The violence he witnessed and participated in during the war shaped his understanding of human nature and left him with a profound sense of life's fragility and meaninglessness. The timing of Bierce's disappearance, coming just before World War I would engulf the world, adds another layer of poignancy to his story. He had lived through one great American conflict and had spent his career trying to make sense of its meaning. His decision to seek out another war in Mexico suggests that he was still searching for answers to questions that had haunted him for half a century. Amelia Earhart disappearance, 1937. On July 2, 1937, at approximately 8:43 a.m. local time, radio operator Leo Bellertz at the Lae airfield in New Guinea received the last confirmed transmission from Amelia Earhart. "We are on the line 157-337, running on line north and south," came the crackling voice through the static. "We are running north and south." 22 hours into what should have been a routine 20-hour flight to Howland Island, Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan were lost somewhere over the vast Pacific Ocean. Within minutes, the most famous female aviator in history had vanished without a trace, creating one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. The disappearance of Amelia Earhart has generated more theories, investigations, and claimed solutions than perhaps any other missing person case in modern history. Yet nearly 90 years later, the basic questions remain unanswered. What happened to Earhart and Noonan? Where did they go down? Are their remains still out there, waiting to be discovered? The mystery begins with the known facts, which are surprisingly few despite the high-profile nature of the case. Earhart and Noonan had taken off from Lae, New Guinea, in a twin-engine Lockheed Electra 10E, loaded with 1,100 gallons of fuel for what would be the most challenging leg of their around-the-world flight attempt. Their destination was Howland Island, a tiny speck of land in the Central Pacific measuring just 1.6 miles long and 0.5 miles wide. The flight plan called for them to navigate 2,556 miles of open ocean to reach this minute target. Weather conditions were poor, with overcast skies and headwinds that would increase fuel consumption. Radio communication was intermittent due to equipment problems and atmospheric interference. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. The official search, launched immediately after Earhart's disappearance, was the largest and most expensive in aviation history up to that point. The US Navy and Coast Guard deployed ships and aircraft across 250,000 square miles of ocean. For 16 days, they found nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no debris field. It was as if the Electra had simply vanished into thin air. The first major theory to emerge was the simplest and most logical. Earhart and Noonan had run out of fuel and crashed into the Pacific Ocean near Howland Island. This crash and sink theory became the official US government position and remains the most widely accepted explanation today. The theory suggests that the Electra, heavy with fuel and equipment, would have sunk quickly in the deep waters of the Pacific, taking any evidence of the crash with it. Supporting this theory is the fact that Earhart's final radio transmissions indicated she was running low on fuel and could not locate Howland Island. The weather conditions were deteriorating and her radio compass was malfunctioning. Under these circumstances, a crash into the ocean would have been almost inevitable. The absence of any debris can be explained by the depth of the water and the ocean currents that would have scattered any floating wreckage. However, the simplicity of this explanation has not satisfied everyone. The complete absence of any trace of the aircraft or its occupants has led researchers to explore alternative theories, some more plausible than others. The second major theory gained prominence in the 1990s through the work of the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, known as TIGAR. This organisation has spent decades investigating the possibility that Earhart and Noonan landed on Gardner Island, now known as Nikumaroro, a small uninhabited coral atoll about 350 miles southeast of Howland Island. The Nikumaroro theory suggests that Earhart, unable to find Howland Island, turned south and made an emergency landing on the reef at Gardner Island. According to this theory, the aviators survived the landing but were stranded on the uninhabited island, where they eventually died as castaways. TIGAR has conducted numerous expeditions to Nikumaroro, claiming to have found artifacts and evidence supporting this theory. The evidence presented by TIGAR includes what they claim are aircraft parts, specifically pieces of aluminum that they believe came from Earhart's Electra. They have also found various tools and personal items that they suggest belong to the missing aviators. Most significantly, they point to bones found on the island in 1940 that they believe belong to Earhart. However, the Nikumaroro theory has faced significant criticism from aviation experts and researchers. The aluminum pieces found on the island have been analysed by independent experts who concluded they did not come from Earhart's aircraft. The thickness, rivet patterns and construction methods do not match those used in the Electra. Instead, they appear to be from later aircraft, possibly a World War II-era PBY flying boat. The bones found on Nikumaroro in 1940 were examined at the time by Dr. David Hoodless, who concluded they belonged to a male of European descent, not Earhart. While TIGAR has attempted to reanalyse these findings using modern techniques, the original bones were lost, leaving only measurements and notes from the 1940 examination. A 2018 study claimed that the bone measurements were consistent with Earhart's body type, but this analysis has been disputed by other researchers who point out the limitations of working with incomplete historical data. The third major theory suggests that Earhart and Noonan were captured by Japanese forces. This theory gained widespread attention in 2017, when a photograph allegedly showing Earhart and Noonan in Japanese custody was discovered in the National Archives. The image, supposedly taken in the Marshall Islands, appeared to show two Caucasian individuals on a dock, with one resembling Earhart and the other Noonan. The Japanese capture theory proposes that Earhart and Noonan, unable to find Howland Island, flew north to the Japanese-controlled Marshall Islands, where they were taken prisoner. Some versions of this theory suggest they were executed as spies, while others claim they were held in Japanese prison camps throughout World War II. However, this theory was quickly debunked when researchers discovered that the photograph had been published in a Japanese travel book in 1935, 2 years before Earhart's disappearance. The image could not have shown Earhart and Noonan because it predated their flight. This revelation effectively demolished the photographic evidence that had seemed to support the Japanese capture theory. Even without the photograph, the Japanese capture theory faces significant challenges. There is no credible evidence that Earhart and Noonan ever reached the Marshall Islands. The flight path and fuel consumption calculations make it unlikely that the Electra could have reached Japanese-controlled territory. Additionally, there are no Japanese records or eyewitness accounts supporting the capture theory. A fourth theory, popular in some circles, suggests that Earhart was on a secret spy mission for the US government. This theory proposes that her around-the-world flight was a cover for surveillance of Japanese military installations in the Pacific. According to this theory, Earhart was deliberately flying over Japanese territory when she was captured or shot down. The spy theory has little credible evidence to support it. While it is true that tensions were rising between the United States and Japan in 1937, there is no documentation in US government archives suggesting that Earhart was involved in espionage activities. The theory appears to be based more on speculation and conspiracy thinking than on factual evidence. More recently, some researchers have proposed that Earhart survived her ordeal and returned to the United States under an assumed identity. This theory suggests that she lived out her days in obscurity, possibly as a housewife in New Jersey named Irene Bolam. However, this theory has been thoroughly debunked through genealogical research and DNA analysis that proved Bolam was not Earhart. The ongoing search for Earhart has employed increasingly sophisticated technology. Deep-sea exploration missions have used sonar mapping, underwater robots, and submersibles to search the ocean floor near Howland Island. These searches have located various aircraft wrecks, but none have been identified as Earhart's Electra. One of the most promising recent developments came in 2019 when explorer Robert Ballard, who discovered the Titanic, launched a new search effort using advanced underwater technology. Ballard's team focused on the waters around Nikumaroro, testing both the crash and sink theory and the castaway theory. While they found no trace of Earhart's aircraft, they did discover evidence of previous searches and confirmed that the area's underwater terrain would make finding wreckage extremely difficult. The scientific approach to solving the Earhart mystery has involved multiple disciplines. Forensic anthropologists have re-examined the bone evidence, while metallurgists have analysed the claimed aircraft parts. Radio propagation experts have studied the atmospheric conditions that affected Earhart's communications, and oceanographers have modelled the drift patterns of debris in the Pacific. Each new piece of evidence has been subjected to rigorous analysis, but none have provided definitive proof of what happened to Earhart and Noonan. The vastness of the Pacific Ocean, the depth of the water, and the passage of time have all worked against efforts to solve the mystery. The psychological appeal of the Earhart mystery goes beyond simple curiosity about a missing person case. Earhart was a pioneering aviator who broke barriers for women in aviation and became an international celebrity. Her disappearance at the height of her fame has created a legend that continues to captivate new generations. The mystery has also been fueled by the heroic nature of her final flight. Earhart was attempting to become the first woman to fly around the world at the equator, a feat that would have cemented her place in aviation history. The fact that she disappeared while pursuing this goal has given her story an almost mythical quality. The search for Earhart has revealed important information about other aspects of Pacific history. Expeditions to various islands have uncovered evidence of World War II battles, ancient Polynesian settlements, and the impacts of climate change on coral atolls. While these discoveries have not solved the Earhart mystery, they have contributed to our understanding of the Pacific region. The technology developed for searching for Earhart has also had broader applications. Deep-sea exploration techniques, underwater robotics, and sonar mapping technologies have been advanced through the search efforts. These innovations have been used in other underwater archaeology projects and marine research. The economic impact of the Earhart mystery has been significant. The search efforts have cost millions of dollars, funded by private organizations, television networks, and government agencies. The story has generated countless books, documentaries, and films, creating a substantial industry around the mystery. Despite decades of investigation and numerous claimed solutions, the disappearance of Amelia Earhart remains unsolved. The most likely explanation, that she and Noonan crashed into the Pacific Ocean near Howland Island, lacks the physical evidence needed for definitive proof. Alternative theories have been proposed and investigated, but none have withstood scientific scrutiny. The mystery continues to attract new researchers and investigators, each hoping to be the one who finally solves the case. New technologies and analytical methods offer hope that future searches might succeed where previous efforts have failed. Advances in underwater exploration, satellite imagery, and DNA analysis could potentially provide the breakthrough that has long eluded investigators. Kremers and Lisanne Froon, 2014. On June 14, 2014, a local woman named Irma was walking along the bank of the Culebra River near the small town of Alto Romero in Panama when she spotted something blue caught in the rocks. As she moved closer, she realized it was a backpack, still in remarkably good condition despite being in the jungle for over 2 months. Inside that backpack, investigators would discover what appeared to be the digital breadcrumbs of a tragedy. A camera and 2 cell phones containing hundreds of photos and data logs that would raise more questions than they answered about what happened to 2 young Dutch women who had vanished into the Panamanian jungle 10 weeks earlier. The discovery of the backpack marked a turning point in the investigation into the disappearance of Kris Kremers, 21, and Lisanne Froon, 22, 2 friends from the Netherlands who had travelled to Panama in March 2014 for a volunteer trip. The backpack belonged to Lisanne, and its contents would provide investigators with their first concrete evidence about the fate of the missing women. Detective Pity Gonzalez, who led the initial investigation for the Panamanian National Police, immediately recognized the significance of the find. The backpack contained Lisanne's Canon PowerShot camera, both women's cell phones, $83 in cash, Lisanne's passport, and other personal items. Most remarkably, everything appeared to be in good condition. Despite having spent months in the humid jungle environment, the camera proved to be the most crucial piece of evidence. When investigators examined the memory card, they found 508 photos spanning from March 29th to April 8th, 2014. The photos from April 1st, the day the women disappeared, showed them hiking happily along the Pianista Trail, taking tourist photos at various landmarks. The final daylight photo, taken at 1:54 p.m. on April 1st, showed Kris standing on a small bridge, apparently at the summit of the trail where it crosses the Continental Divide. What the photos revealed next would puzzle investigators for years to come. After a gap of 8 days, the camera was activated again on April 8th at 1:20 a.m. Between 1:20 a.m. and 4:12 a.m., someone took 90 photos in rapid succession using the camera's flash. These became known as the night photos, and they would become central to understanding what happened to the 2 women. Dr. Georgina Pacheco, a forensic expert who analysed the digital evidence, found that the night photos showed various jungle scenes, rocks, trees, branches, and what appeared to be a makeshift camp or shelter. Many of the photos were dark and difficult to interpret, but they clearly showed that at least one of the women was alive and attempting to signal for help a full week after their disappearance. The cell phone data provided another crucial timeline. Both women's phones showed multiple attempts to call emergency services starting just hours after their final daylight photo. On April 1st, at 4:39 p.m, Kris's iPhone was used to dial 112, the European emergency number. The call didn't connect due to lack of signal. Just 1 minute later, at 4:40 p.m, Lisanne's Samsung phone was used to dial 911. This call also failed to connect. Francisco Sanchez, a telecommunications expert who analysed the phone data for the investigation, found that the women continued attempting to call for help over the following days. The phones were turned on and off at regular intervals, suggesting the women were conserving battery power while trying to find a signal. The last successful phone activity was recorded on April 11th, 10 days after the disappearance. The timing of the emergency calls was particularly significant to investigators. The calls began just 3 hours after the final daylight photo, suggesting that whatever happened to the women occurred in the late afternoon of April 1st. This timing would become crucial in developing theories about their fate. Dr. Octavio Calderon, a forensic pathologist who worked on the case, noted that the pattern of phone usage suggested the women were alive for at least several days after their disappearance. The regular intervals between phone activations and the strategic use of the camera flash indicated deliberate actions rather than accidental activation. The night photos themselves presented a puzzle that investigators struggled to solve. Photo number 580 appeared to show the back of Kris's head with her blonde hair visible, while photo 579 seemed to show what might have been a makeshift shelter or camp. Other photos showed jungle vegetation, rocks, and what appeared to be reflective objects that might have been used as signals. Juan Carlos Moreira, a local guide who assisted in the search efforts, believed the night photos were taken at a location along the Culebra River, possibly near where the backpack was eventually found. The vegetation and rock formations in the photos seemed consistent with the river valley environment. The investigation team also consulted with survival experts to understand the women's likely behaviour in the jungle. Dr. Kenneth Kamler, a physician who has studied survival psychology, noted that the methodical nature of the phone usage and photo taking suggested the women were thinking rationally and attempting to signal for help rather than panicking. However, the investigation faced significant challenges. The area where the women disappeared was extremely remote and difficult to access. The jungle was dense with numerous ravines, rivers and cliffs that could easily trap or injure hikers. Weather conditions during their disappearance included heavy rainfall, which would have made survival more difficult. The search efforts were complicated by the fact that the women had apparently left the established trail. The Pianista Trail was well marked and regularly used by tourists, but the photos suggested the women had continued beyond the normal turning point and descended into the jungle on the other side of the Continental Divide. Local authorities organised multiple search parties involving hundreds of volunteers, including indigenous guides who knew the terrain intimately. Betsaida Pitti, the prosecutor who oversaw the investigation, coordinated efforts between Dutch and Panamanian authorities, including bringing in forensic experts from the Netherlands. The discovery of human remains in late August 2014 provided additional evidence but also raised new questions. A local indigenous woman found a hiking boot with a foot still inside, which was later identified as belonging to Lisanne through DNA analysis. Over the following weeks, search teams found additional bone fragments from both women scattered along the riverbank. Dr. Georgina Pacheco conducted the forensic analysis of the bone remains and found that they were in various stages of decomposition. Some bones showed signs of natural decomposition, while others appeared to have been cleanly cut or broken. The condition of the bones was inconsistent with what would be expected from a simple accident or natural death in the jungle. The investigation revealed that Lisanne's bones still had some tissue attached, while Kris's bones appeared to have been completely cleaned. This difference in decomposition rates puzzled forensic experts, as both women had disappeared at the same time and would have been exposed to similar environmental conditions. Pathologist Dr. Octavio Calderon noted that several of the bones showed unusual characteristics. Some appeared to have been bleached, while others showed what might have been tool marks. The analysis was complicated by the fact that the bones had been in the jungle environment for months and had been subjected to various natural processes. The investigation also uncovered irregularities in the initial search efforts. Despite the women being reported missing on April 2nd, organised search efforts didn't begin until several days later. Local authorities initially assumed the women had simply gotten lost and would find their way back to the trail. Detective Pitti Gonzalez acknowledged that the delayed response may have cost valuable time when the women might still have been alive. The phone data showed that the women survived for several days after their disappearance, and a more immediate search effort might have located them in time. The case attracted international attention, with Dutch investigators working alongside Panamanian authorities. The Dutch prosecution service sent forensic experts to Panama to analyse the evidence and ensure the investigation met international standards. One of the most controversial aspects of the investigation was the condition of the backpack when it was found. Despite being in the jungle for over 2 months during the rainy season, the backpack and its contents were in remarkably good condition. Critics argued that this was inconsistent with the harsh jungle environment and suggested that the backpack might have been planted. However, investigators noted that the backpack was found in a relatively dry location under rocks, which might have protected it from the worst of the weather. The items inside were wrapped in plastic bags, which would have provided additional protection from moisture. The investigation also examined the possibility of foul play. The area where the women disappeared was generally considered safe for tourists, but there had been occasional reports of crime against visitors. However, investigators found no evidence of robbery or sexual assault. Local guides and authorities emphasised that the jungle environment itself was extremely dangerous, particularly for inexperienced hikers. The terrain included numerous cliffs, fast-moving rivers, and dense vegetation where someone could easily become lost or injured. Dr. Michael Dobson, a forensic anthropologist who reviewed the case, noted that the evidence was consistent with the women becoming lost in the jungle and eventually succumbing to the elements. The phone data and photos suggested they survived for several days while attempting to signal for help, which was consistent with this theory. The investigation also revealed that the women had not informed anyone of their specific hiking plans for April 1st. They had been scheduled to volunteer at a local school, but had decided to go hiking instead. This last-minute change meant that no one knew exactly where they had gone or when to expect them back. The case highlighted the challenges of investigating disappearances in remote areas with limited infrastructure. The dense jungle environment made search efforts extremely difficult, and the lack of communication infrastructure meant that emergency calls couldn't be completed. Despite extensive investigation by both Panamanian and Dutch authorities, many questions about the case remain unanswered. The investigation officially concluded that the women became lost in the jungle and died from exposure and dehydration, but the mysterious circumstances surrounding their disappearance continue to generate debate and speculation. The night photos in particular continue to puzzle investigators and amateur analysts. While they clearly show that at least one of the women was alive a week after their disappearance, the specific location where they were taken and the circumstances surrounding their creation remain unclear. Ben McDaniel, Disappearance, 2010. Every experienced diver knows that caves hold a special kind of danger, a darkness that can swallow a person whole and never give them back. On the afternoon of August 18, 2010, the crystal-clear waters of Vortex Spring in Ponce de Leon, Florida, appeared deceptively peaceful. The temperature was a comfortable 68 degrees, the visibility was excellent, and the constant flow of spring water created the perfect conditions for diving. For 30-year-old Ben McDaniel, this familiar underwater cave system had become almost a second home over the past few months. He had been diving here regularly, sometimes daily, building his confidence and pushing his limits in the challenging environment. What none of the other divers at the spring could have predicted was that this would be the last time anyone would see Ben McDaniel alive. Ben had arrived at Vortex Spring around 1 p.m. that Wednesday afternoon, following his usual routine. He parked his pickup truck in the familiar spot and began the methodical process of preparing his diving equipment. The 30-year-old had been diving for several years and had developed a reputation among the local diving community as someone who was passionate about the sport but perhaps not as experienced as he believed himself to be. Ben carried his gear to the dive platform where he began the careful process of assembly and equipment checks. His diving setup included a wetsuit, mask, fins, and a single tank of compressed air. He had been working on improving his cave diving skills over the past several months, though he was not yet certified for cave diving. This lack of certification was a source of some concern among the more experienced divers at Vortex Spring, who had noticed Ben's frequent visits and his tendency to push beyond the recommended limits for open water divers. At approximately 2:30 p.m, Ben completed his first dive of the day. He descended into the spring's main basin, which opens into a large underwater cavern about 58 feet below the surface. The cavern is spacious and well lit by natural sunlight filtering down from above, making it a popular spot for recreational divers. Ben spent about 30 minutes exploring the cavern area before returning to the surface. After his first dive, Ben spent time on the surface, sitting on the dock and making notes in his dive log. This was part of his regular routine, documenting his dives, equipment configuration, and any observations about the underwater environment. Other divers at the spring that day later remembered seeing Ben during this surface interval, appearing relaxed and in good spirits. Chuck Cronin, an experienced cave diver and instructor who frequently dove at Vortex Spring, arrived at the facility around 3 p.m. with his diving partner Eduardo Terran. Both men knew Ben from his regular visits to the spring and had previously expressed concerns about his diving practices. They had noticed that Ben often dove alone and seemed to be pushing deeper into the cave system than his training level would typically allow. Ben began preparing for his second dive around 4 p.m. He checked his equipment more thoroughly this time, testing his regulator and ensuring his tank was properly filled. The afternoon was getting later, and the spring would close at sunset, so Ben knew this would likely be his final dive of the day. He donned his wetsuit and gear, performed his final equipment checks, and entered the water from the dive platform. At 4:20 p.m, Ben began his descent into the spring. Unlike his earlier dive, this time he headed directly toward the cave entrance, located at the back of the main cavern. The cave entrance is marked by a sign warning that cave diving is extremely dangerous and should only be attempted by properly trained and certified divers. Ben had passed this sign many times before, and witnesses had seen him venture beyond it on previous occasions. The cave system at Vortex Spring extends horizontally from the main cavern for about 1,000 feet, gradually narrowing as it penetrates deeper into the limestone formation. The first section of the cave is relatively wide and still receives some natural light from the cavern entrance. However, as divers proceed deeper, the cave becomes increasingly narrow and dark, requiring artificial lighting and specialized cave diving skills. At approximately 4:30 p.m, other divers at the spring noticed Ben's bubbles moving deeper into the cave system. This was not unusual for Ben, as he had been exploring progressively deeper sections of the cave over the past few months. However, what would later become significant was that these were the last confirmed sightings of Ben McDaniel alive. Chuck Cronin and Eduardo Terran entered the water around 4:45 p.m. for their own dive. Both men were experienced cave divers with the proper training and certification to safely explore the deeper sections of the cave system. They had planned to do some practice diving in the cave to maintain their skills and familiarity with the environment. As Cronin and Terran descended toward the cave entrance, they expected to encounter Ben somewhere in the cave system. They knew he was ahead of them and assumed they would either meet him coming out or find him exploring one of the side passages. However, as they penetrated deeper into the cave, they found no sign of Ben or his equipment. By 5 p.m, Cronin and Terran had explored the main sections of the cave system without finding any trace of Ben. They began to feel concerned, as they knew Ben was not certified for cave diving and might be in trouble. They decided to extend their search, checking side passages and areas where a diver might have become lost or disoriented. The two experienced divers spent the next 30 minutes conducting a thorough search of the accessible portions of the cave system. They checked every passage, every chamber, and every possible location where Ben might have gone. They found no sign of him, his equipment, or any evidence of his passage through the cave. At 5:30 p.m, Cronin and Terran surfaced and immediately reported their concerns to the spring's management. They explained that Ben McDaniel had entered the cave system approximately an hour earlier and had not been seen since. Given Ben's lack of cave diving certification and the potential dangers of the environment, they believed an immediate search was warranted. The spring's management contacted local emergency services, and the first rescue divers arrived at Vortex Spring around 6 p.m. The initial response team included certified cave divers from the local sheriff's department and volunteer rescue organizations. They entered the water immediately and began a systematic search of the cave system. The rescue divers followed the same route that Cronin and Terran had taken, checking all accessible areas of the cave. They used powerful underwater lights to illuminate even the darkest corners and crevices. The search was methodical and thorough, with divers checking every possible location where Ben might have gone. By 7 p.m, the initial search team had covered the entire accessible portion of the cave system without finding any trace of Ben. The cave diving community is small and tight-knit, and word of Ben's disappearance spread quickly. Additional experienced cave divers began arriving at Vortex Spring to assist in the search effort. As darkness fell, the search continued under artificial lighting. Powerful floodlights were set up around the spring to illuminate the surface area, while underwater searches continued in the cave system. The search teams worked in shifts, with fresh divers replacing those who had exhausted their air supply or become fatigued. The search effort expanded throughout the night of August 18th. Teams of divers worked continuously, exploring every accessible section of the cave system. They checked and rechecked areas where Ben might have become trapped or disoriented. The search was complicated by the cave's complex layout, with multiple passages and chambers that required careful, systematic exploration. By the morning of August 19th, professional cave rescue teams had arrived from across Florida and neighboring states. These specialists brought advanced equipment and techniques specifically designed for cave rescue operations. They used specialized rebreathers that allowed for longer bottom times and sonar equipment to detect objects in the murky water. The search teams discovered that the cave system was more complex than initially realized. Beyond the main passages that recreational divers typically explored, there were numerous side passages, tight restrictions, and deep sections that required advanced cave diving skills to navigate safely. The teams began exploring these previously uncharted areas, hoping to find some trace of Ben. On August 20th, 2 days after Ben's disappearance, The search effort reached its peak intensity. Teams of technical divers were exploring the deepest and most remote sections of the cave system. They discovered new passages that extended far beyond the previously mapped areas of the cave. Each new discovery raised hopes that Ben might be found, but also revealed the enormous complexity of the search area. The search teams used specialized equipment, including underwater metal detectors, sonar systems, and high-powered lights to search for any trace of Ben or his equipment. They methodically explored every accessible area of the cave system, mapping new passages and chambers as they went. By August 21st, the search effort had expanded to include the possibility that Ben's body might have been washed out of the cave system by the spring's current. Teams began searching the spring's outflow channel and the surrounding area where the spring water emerged from the ground. They used boats and underwater vehicles to search these areas systematically. The search continued for several more days, with teams exploring increasingly remote and dangerous sections of the cave system. They discovered that the cave extended much further than anyone had previously known, with some passages extending over 1,000 feet from the main entrance. The complexity of the cave system made it impossible to search every possible location where Ben might have gone. On August 24th, 6 days after Ben's disappearance, the official search effort was scaled back. The professional rescue teams had explored every accessible area of the cave system and had found no trace of Ben McDaniel or his equipment. The case was turned over to local law enforcement as a missing person investigation. The Holmes County Sheriff's Office took over the investigation, working with diving experts and the spring's management to piece together the events of August 18th. They interviewed everyone who had been at the spring that day, reviewed Ben's diving logs, and examined his equipment to look for clues about what might have happened. The investigation revealed that Ben had been diving at Vortex Spring regularly for several months, sometimes daily. He had been progressively exploring deeper sections of the cave system, despite lacking the proper certification for cave diving. Other divers had expressed concerns about his practices, but Ben had been confident in his abilities and had continued to push his limits. The mystery of Ben McDaniel's disappearance deepened when investigators discovered that the cave system at Vortex Spring was not as straightforward as it appeared. The spring's owner revealed that there were additional passages and chambers that were not accessible to recreational divers, and that the cave system was much more extensive than most people realized. Private investigators hired by Ben's family conducted their own search efforts, bringing in additional expert cave divers and specialized equipment. They explored areas that had not been thoroughly searched during the initial rescue effort and discovered new passages and chambers. However, they too found no trace of Ben or his equipment. The case attracted national attention, with diving experts and investigators from around the country offering their assistance. The diving community was particularly interested in the case because of the unusual circumstances, an experienced diver vanishing completely in a relatively well-known cave system. As weeks turned into months, the search for Ben McDaniel continued on a smaller scale. His family maintained hope that he might still be alive, possibly trapped in an unexplored section of the cave system. However, cave diving experts explained that survival in the cave environment without proper equipment would be impossible for more than a few hours. The investigation continued to reveal new information about the cave system and Ben's diving practices. It became clear that the cave was far more complex and dangerous than most recreational divers realized, with multiple levels, tight restrictions, and areas that required advanced technical diving skills to navigate safely. Geraldine Largay, 2013. The dream had been years in the making. For Geraldine Jerry Largay, the idea of hiking the entire Appalachian Trail wasn't just about conquering 2,190 miles of wilderness. It was about proving something to herself and honouring a promise she had made to her late father. At 66 years old, this retired Air Force nurse from Tennessee had already raised her children, built a career caring for others, and supported her husband George through decades of military service. Now, in what should have been her golden years, she was ready to embark on the adventure of a lifetime. The trail name she chose for herself, Inchworm, reflected both her modest approach to hiking and her determination to move forward steadily, no matter how slowly. Jerry's decision to hike the Appalachian Trail wasn't born from a sudden midlife crisis or a desire to escape her responsibilities. It came from a deep personal connection to the outdoors that had been cultivated over decades of hiking shorter trails near her home in Tennessee. She'd always been the type of person who found peace in nature, someone who could spend hours walking through forests, observing wildlife, and finding comfort in the rhythm of her own footsteps. But the Appalachian Trail represented something more significant, a chance to challenge herself physically and mentally while fulfilling a dream that had been deferred for too long. George Largay, her husband of many years, understood his wife's need for this adventure, even if he didn't fully share her enthusiasm for long-distance hiking. Their marriage had been built on mutual respect and support, weathering the challenges of military life, raising their daughter Kerry, and building a life together in Tennessee. George knew that Jerry needed this experience, that it represented something essential to her sense of self and her vision of what her retirement years could be. He supported her decision wholeheartedly, even as he worried about the physical demands and potential dangers of such an undertaking. The planning for Jerry's through hike was meticulous. She spent months researching the trail, studying maps, reading guidebooks, and connecting with other hikers who had completed the journey. She took a course specifically designed for Appalachian Trail through hikers, learning about gear selection, trail navigation, food planning, and wilderness safety. She tested her equipment on local trails, gradually building up her endurance and confidence. For someone who had always been methodical and prepared, traits that had served her well in her nursing career, this thorough preparation felt natural and necessary. Jerry's daughter Kerry watched her mother's preparations with a mixture of pride and concern. Kerry understood that her mother was entering a new phase of life, one where she was free to pursue her own interests and dreams after decades of caring for others. But Kerry also worried about the physical challenges her 66-year-old mother would face on the trail. The Appalachian Trail was notoriously difficult, with steep climbs, unpredictable weather, and numerous opportunities for injury or mishap. However, Kerry also knew that her mother was strong-willed and determined, someone who didn't give up easily once she set her mind to something. The family dynamic around Jerry's through-hike attempt was complex. While George and Kerry supported her decision, they also felt a natural anxiety about her safety. They had researched the trail themselves and understood the risks involved. The wilderness areas of the Appalachian Trail were remote and unforgiving, places where a wrong turn or a moment of inattention could have serious consequences. But they also recognized that Jerry needed this challenge, that it represented a form of personal fulfillment that was essential to her happiness and sense of purpose. Jerry began her through-hike attempt on April 23, 2013, starting from Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. She was joined by her friend Jane Lee, who planned to hike a portion of the trail with her before returning home. The two women had been friends for years, bonding over their shared love of hiking and the outdoors. Jane's presence provided companionship and an extra measure of safety for the early portions of the hike, when Jerry was still adjusting to the demands of life on the trail. The first weeks of the hike went well. Jerry maintained regular contact with George through text messages and phone calls, sharing updates about her progress, the people she met on the trail, and the challenges she was facing. Her messages reflected her characteristic optimism and determination, even as she dealt with the physical demands of hiking day after day. She wrote about the beauty of the wilderness, the kindness of fellow hikers, and her growing confidence in her abilities. As Jerry progressed northward through Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York, she began to find her rhythm on the trail. She was hiking at her own pace, taking time to appreciate the scenery and enjoy the experience rather than rushing to complete miles. Her trail name Inchworm proved to be appropriate. She was indeed moving slowly but steadily, making consistent progress toward her goal of reaching Mount Katahdin in Maine. The psychological aspects of long-distance hiking began to emerge as Jerry spent more time on the trail. The daily routine of hiking, eating, and sleeping became a form of meditation, a way of simplifying life down to its most basic elements. She found that the physical challenges of the trail helped her process emotions and thoughts that had been buried beneath the responsibilities of daily life. The trail provided a kind of therapy, a chance to reconnect with herself and her own needs after years of focusing on others. By the time Jerry reached New England, she'd been hiking for several weeks and had developed the physical and mental toughness necessary for long-distance hiking. She had learned to manage her gear efficiently, to navigate using maps and trail markers, and to deal with the inevitable discomforts of life on the trail. Her confidence had grown, and she was beginning to believe that she could actually complete the entire through hike. The relationship between Jerry and George evolved during her time on the trail. Their daily text messages and phone calls became a lifeline, a way of maintaining their connection despite the physical distance. George lived vicariously through Jerry's adventure, sharing her excitement about reaching certain milestones and worrying about her safety during difficult sections of the trail. These communications revealed the deep bond between them, built on years of shared experiences and mutual support. As Jerry entered Vermont and then New Hampshire, she faced some of the most challenging terrain on the entire Appalachian Trail. The White Mountains of New Hampshire are notoriously difficult, with steep climbs, unpredictable weather, and rocky technical terrain that can be dangerous even for experienced hikers. Jerry's progress slowed as she navigated these challenges, but she remained determined to continue. The psychological pressure of the approaching end of the hiking season began to weigh on Jerry as she entered Maine. The weather was becoming increasingly unpredictable, with the possibility of snow and cold temperatures that could make hiking dangerous or impossible. She knew that she needed to reach Mount Katahdin before the weather turned, adding a sense of urgency to her hiking that hadn't been present in the earlier sections of the trail. On July 21, 2013, Jerry reached the area near Poplar Ridge Lean-To in Maine, about 200 miles from her goal of Mount Katahdin. She was hiking alone at this point, Jane Lee having returned home weeks earlier. The isolation of the Maine wilderness was more pronounced than anything she had experienced on the trail, with long stretches between road crossings and limited opportunities for resupply or communication with the outside world. The morning of July 22, 2013, began like any other day on the trail for Jerry. She packed her gear, ate breakfast, and began hiking northward along the Appalachian Trail. The weather was typical for July in Maine, warm but with the possibility of afternoon thunderstorms. The trail in this section wound through dense forest, with occasional views of the surrounding mountains and valleys. At some point during the morning, Jerry left the trail to relieve herself, a common and necessary practice for all hikers. This was such a routine activity that she probably didn't think twice about it. She likely expected to be off the trail for just a few minutes before returning to her northward journey. However, the dense forest and lack of distinct landmarks made it easy to become disoriented, especially for someone who was tired from weeks of hiking and dealing with the mental fatigue that comes with long-distance hiking. When Jerry tried to return to the trail, she found herself unable to relocate it. The forest all looked the same, and without clear landmarks or distinctive features, it was impossible to determine which direction led back to the trail. She had made a simple mistake that thousands of hikers make every year, but in this case, the consequences would be catastrophic. Jerry's first instinct was to try to find the trail by walking in what she thought was the right direction. This is a natural response but often makes the situation worse, as it takes the lost person further from their original location. As she walked through the forest, trying to find familiar landmarks or signs of the trail, she became increasingly disoriented and panicked. The psychological impact of becoming lost in the wilderness cannot be overstated. For someone like Jerry, who prided herself on being prepared and competent, the realization that she had made such a basic mistake was devastating. The forest that had been her home for months suddenly became an alien and threatening environment. Every tree looked the same, every direction seemed equally likely to lead back to the trail. As hours passed without finding the trail, Jerry's situation became increasingly serious. She had limited food and water with her, having planned to reach a resupply point later that day. The weather was becoming overcast, and the possibility of rain would make her situation even more difficult. She began to realize that she was in serious trouble and needed to focus on survival rather than continuing to search for the trail. Jerry's survival instincts, honed by years of outdoor experience and her military training, began to take over. She found a relatively sheltered spot and set up her tent, creating a base camp that would protect her from the elements. She rationed her food and water carefully, knowing that rescue might not come quickly. She also began trying to signal for help, using her whistle and creating visible markers that might attract the attention of search planes or other hikers. The psychological challenges of being lost in the wilderness are as serious as the physical ones. Jerry faced the constant stress of not knowing whether she would be found, combined with the guilt and self-blame that comes with making a mistake that puts others at risk. She knew that her family would be worried sick and that search and rescue teams would be looking for her, putting themselves in danger on her behalf. As days passed, Jerry's situation became increasingly desperate. Her food supplies were dwindling and she was becoming physically weakened by the stress and lack of proper nutrition. The psychological toll was equally severe as she struggled with feelings of hopelessness and despair. However, she also showed remarkable resilience and determination, continuing to try to signal for help and maintain her morale despite the increasingly dire circumstances. Jerry's training as a nurse served her well during this ordeal. She understood the importance of staying hydrated, conserving energy, and maintaining her physical and mental health as much as possible. She also knew the signs of hypothermia, dehydration, and other medical emergencies, allowing her to monitor her own condition and make informed decisions about her care. The journal entries that Jerry wrote during her time lost in the wilderness provide a heartbreaking glimpse into her psychological state. She wrote about her love for George and Kerry, her regrets about the mistake that had led to her situation, and her hope that she would eventually be found. Her writing remained lucid and coherent, even as her physical condition deteriorated, testament to her mental strength and determination. In her journal, Jerry also wrote about her acceptance of the possibility that she might not survive. She composed messages to her family, expressing her love and asking that they not blame themselves for her situation. These entries revealed the depth of her character and her concern for others, even in her darkest moments. The search for Jerry involved hundreds of volunteers, professional search and rescue teams, and aircraft conducting aerial searches of the vast wilderness area. The terrain was so dense and difficult that searchers passed within a few hundred yards of her location without seeing her tent or other signs of her presence. The psychological impact on her family was devastating, as they maintained hope while dealing with the growing realization that Jerry might not be found alive. Jerry's final journal entry, written on August 6, 2013, revealed her awareness that she was dying and her desire to provide closure for her family. "When you find my body, please call my husband George and my daughter Kerry," she wrote. "It will be the greatest kindness for them to know that I am dead and where you found me, no matter how many years from now." These words demonstrated her continued concern for others and her hope that her family would eventually have the closure they needed. The discovery of Jerry's remains in October 2015, more than 2 years after her disappearance, brought both relief and profound sadness to her family. The investigation revealed that she had survived for 26 days in the wilderness, far longer than most experts thought possible. Her story became a testament to human resilience and the power of the human spirit to endure even in the face of impossible odds. The psychological impact of Jerry's story extends beyond her immediate family to the broader hiking community and anyone who has ever faced adversity. Her courage, determination, and concern for others in her final days serve as an inspiration and a reminder of the importance of preparation, caution, and the bonds that connect us to the people we love. The Springfield Three, 1992. The phone call that would launch one of Missouri's most perplexing missing persons investigations came at 9 p.m. on June 7, 1992. On the other end of the line was Janice McCall, a worried mother who had been trying to reach her 18-year-old daughter Stacy all day. What she told the Springfield police dispatcher would begin an investigation that has consumed law enforcement resources for over 30 years and left 3 families without answers about what happened to their loved ones on a warm summer night in 1992. When Springfield police officers arrived at 1717 East Delmar Street, they found a scene that would haunt investigators for decades. The small ranch-style home appeared normal at first glance, but subtle details painted a picture of something terribly wrong. 3 cars sat in the driveway, a green Dodge Spirit, a red Ford Escort, and a yellow Mitsubishi, suggesting that all 3 women should have been home. Yet no one answered the door, and a broken porch-like globe lay shattered on the front step, its fragments scattered across the concrete. Detective Tony Glenn, one of the first investigators on the scene, immediately noticed the contradictions. The front door was locked, but the porch light fixture was damaged, with the glass globe broken and pieces lying around the entrance. Inside the house, investigators found the television still on, the women's purses sitting on the kitchen counter with money and credit cards untouched, and no signs of forced entry anywhere in the home. The initial investigation revealed that 47-year-old Cheryl Levitt, her 19-year-old daughter Suzanne Susie Streeter, and Susie's best friend 18-year-old Stacy McCall had simply vanished without a trace. The beds appeared to have been slept in, suggesting the women had gone to bed normally before something happened in the early morning hours. Susie's small dog, a Yorkshire Terrier named Cinnamon, was found unharmed in the house but clearly agitated. Sergeant John Ridings, who took over the investigation in the following days, established a timeline that would become crucial to understanding the case. The three women had last been seen around 2:15 a.m. on June 7th, when Susie and Stacey returned to Cheryl's home after attending graduation parties. The discovery of their absence didn't occur until much later that day, when friends became concerned about their whereabouts. The crime scene processing revealed disturbing details that investigators struggled to interpret. The broken porch light became a focal point of the investigation. The glass globe had been shattered, but whether this was done from inside or outside the house was unclear. Some investigators believed it might have been broken during a struggle, while others thought it could have been accidental damage that occurred during the night. Detective Glenn's examination of the house interior found no signs of a struggle. The women's belongings were undisturbed, their keys were still in the house, and there were no obvious signs of violence. However, the telephone answering machine contained a disturbing message that investigators would analyse for the years to come. The message, which was described as obscene and threatening, had been left sometime during the night, but the exact timing was unclear. The investigation team, led by Detective Clay West, began the painstaking process of interviewing everyone who had contact with the three women in the days leading up to their disappearance. They discovered that the night of June 6th had been particularly significant. It was graduation night for Susie and Stacey, who had just finished their senior year at Kickapoo High School. The timeline reconstruction revealed that Susie and Stacey had originally planned to stay at a friend's house after the graduation parties, but changed their plans at the last minute and decided to return to Cheryl's home instead. This spontaneous decision meant that very few people knew where the girls would be sleeping that night, which investigators found significant. Dr. Joseph Haber, a forensic psychologist who consulted on the case, noted that the lack of personal belongings taken from the house suggested the women had not left voluntarily. When people disappear on their own, they typically take identification, money and personal items, he explained to investigators. The fact that purses, keys and even cigarettes were left behind indicates this was not a voluntary departure. The investigation expanded to include extensive searches of the surrounding area. Springfield Police coordinated with the Missouri State Highway Patrol and Greene County Sheriff's Department to conduct ground searches of nearby wooded areas, abandoned buildings and rural properties. Helicopters and search dogs were used to cover vast areas of the Missouri countryside, but no trace of the women was found. Detective West's team also focused on the physical evidence from the house. The broken porch light glass was sent to the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab for analysis, but the results were inconclusive. The fragments could not determine whether the breakage occurred from inside or outside the house, and there were no fingerprints or other evidence on the glass pieces. The telephone records became a crucial part of the investigation. Detective Glenn discovered that several calls had been made to the Levitt home throughout the night, but most were from friends trying to reach the women. The threatening message on the answering machine was analysed by FBI behavioural specialists, who concluded that it was likely left by someone who knew the women or had some connection to them. FBI Special Agent Mark James joined the investigation in the summer of 1992, bringing federal resources to bear on the case. The FBI's involvement allowed for more sophisticated forensic analysis and expanded the investigation beyond Missouri's borders. Agent James noted that the complete absence of the women, combined with the undisturbed nature of their belongings, suggested they were likely victims of foul play. The investigation revealed that all three women had been living relatively normal lives with no obvious enemies or threats. Cheryl Levitt was a divorced hairstylist who worked at a local salon. She had been in the process of selling her house and had recently ended a relationship, but investigators found no evidence that either situation was connected to the disappearance. Detective Reading's interviews with friends and family members revealed no history of the women discussing plans to leave town or any indication that they were in danger. The spontaneous nature of their disappearance, occurring on what should have been a celebration night, made the case even more puzzling. The crime scene analysis conducted by Missouri State Highway Patrol investigators found trace evidence throughout the house, but nothing that provided clear leads. Hair and fibre samples were collected from the bedrooms, But DNA analysis in 1992 was not as advanced as it would become in later years. The evidence was preserved for future analysis as technology improved. One of the most significant aspects of the investigation was the contamination of the crime scene that occurred before police arrived. Well-meaning friends and family members had entered the house, moved items around, and even cleaned up the broken glass from the porch light. This contamination made it difficult for investigators to determine what evidence was relevant to the disappearance. Detective Glenn noted that the case was unusual in that there were no witnesses to the actual disappearance. Most missing person cases have some evidence of the person's final movements or interactions, but in this case, the women simply vanished from inside a locked house with no indication of what happened to them. The investigation team consulted with experts in criminal psychology and kidnapping cases. Dr. Susan Mitchell, a specialist in missing persons cases, reviewed the evidence and concluded that the circumstances suggested the women were taken against their will by someone who had planned the crime carefully. The lack of disturbance in the house and the fact that all 3 women disappeared simultaneously suggested a level of control that would be difficult to achieve without planning. As weeks turned into months, the investigation expanded to include hundreds of interviews and thousands of tips from the public. The case received significant media attention, and the Springfield Police Department established a dedicated tip line to handle the volume of calls. Detective West's team followed up on every credible lead, but none provided breakthrough information. The investigation revealed several persons of interest, including men who had been seen in the area around the time of the disappearance and individuals who had previous contact with the women. However, none of these leads resulted in arrests or significant developments in the case. One of the most frustrating aspects of the investigation was the lack of physical evidence pointing to a specific perpetrator. The house had been processed thoroughly, but the absence of signs of struggle or forced entry made it difficult to determine how the women had been taken from the home. Detective Clay Wurst, who became the lead investigator on the case, noted that the Springfield Three case was unique in his experience. Most missing person cases have some evidence of where the person went or what happened to them, he explained. In this case, we had 3 people who simply vanished without leaving any trace of their fate. The investigation also included extensive background checks on all 3 women, looking for any connections to criminal activity or dangerous individuals. Investigators found no evidence that any of the women were involved in anything that would have put them at risk. The case files grew to include thousands of pages of reports, interviews, and evidence analysis. The Springfield Police Department created a dedicated task force to handle the investigation, and the case became one of the most resource-intensive investigations in the department's history. The forensic evidence from the house was re-examined multiple times as technology advanced. DNA analysis became more sophisticated, and investigators were able to extract genetic profiles from evidence that had been collected in 1992. However, these analyses did not provide new leads or identify suspects. The investigation has continued for over 3 decades, with new investigators periodically reviewing the case files and following up on new tips. The Springfield Police Department has never closed the case, and it remains an active investigation today. The impact of the Springfield Three case extends beyond the immediate families affected. The disappearance has become part of Springfield's local history, and the case has influenced how missing person investigations are conducted. The early contamination of the crime scene led to changes in police procedures for securing and processing missing person scenes. The case has also attracted attention from amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts who have developed their own theories about what happened to the 3 women. Some of these theories have been investigated by police, but none have resulted in significant developments in the case. The ongoing investigation continues to generate new leads and theories, but the fundamental questions about what happened to Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacey McCall remain unanswered. The case stands as one of the most perplexing missing person investigations in American criminal history, a mystery that has resisted solution despite decades of intensive investigation.